I am Hannah, 33 years old, and I destroy failing companies for a living as a corporate restructuring consultant. When my father handed my brother the family empire, the trust fund, and their $2.8 million mansion at a country club dinner, I did not shed a single tear. When he looked at me and said I got nothing because I refused to be his unpaid assistant at 18, I just raised my glass. I had no idea that a few short months later, I would be the one holding the deed to that exact mansion and liquidating his precious company. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic parents who severely underestimated your worth. The crystal glasses chimed against each other, producing a sharp ringing sound that echoed through the private dining room of the Oakwood Country Club. It was a Saturday evening in Chicago, and the room was filled with the city elite wealthy business owners, socialites, and investors who thrived on maintaining perfect appearances. The air smelled of expensive roasted meats and heavy floral perfumes. I sat near the end of the long mahogany table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit, quietly observing the performance happening in front of me. At the head of the table stood my father, Richard. He was 62 years old, wearing a custom tuxedo that hid his expanding waistline, his face flushed with champagne and arrogance. My mother, Diane, sat beside him. At 60 years old, she spent most of her time and family money preserving her youth and her social standing among the country club wives. She was smiling brightly, projecting the image of a flawless matriarch. Directly across from me sat my older brother, Preston. At 35 years old, he was the undisputed golden child of the family. He had been handed every advantage, every promotion, and every excuse for his constant failures. Next to him was his wife, Kiara, a 32-year-old African-American lifestyle influencer who treated our family gatherings like her personal photo shoots. She was currently adjusting her hair, holding up her phone to record the dinner for her followers, completely ignoring the actual conversation happening around her. She loved the wealthy aesthetic my family provided, and she never missed an opportunity to look down on me because I chose to work a demanding corporate job instead of marrying into money. My father tapped his silver spoon against his champagne flute, demanding silence from the room. The murmurs of the wealthy guests faded away, and all eyes turned to him. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, knowing exactly what was coming. This dinner was not a casual family gathering. It was a coronation. "Thank you all for being here tonight," my father began, his voice booming with practiced authority. "As many of you know, I have spent the last 40 years building this manufacturing company from the ground up. It has been my life work. But a true leader knows when it is time to pass the torch to the next generation." He looked down at Preston with such intense pride that it almost made me sick. I watched Preston puff out his chest, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Therefore, my father continued, his voice rising dramatically, "I am officially announcing my retirement. Effective immediately, I am transferring 100% of the company shares to my son, Preston. Furthermore, to ensure the stability of our family legacy, the family trust and the deed to our $2.8 million Oakwood estate will also be transferred entirely to him. Preston has proven himself ready to lead, and he deserves to carry our name into the future." The room erupted into polite applause. Kiara squealed with delight, making sure her phone camera caught her reaction. She blatantly raised her left hand, flashing a massive new diamond ring that I knew for a fact had been purchased using the company corporate credit card just last week. She caught my eye across the table and smirked a cruel, victorious little smile that silently told me I was nothing but a peasant in their royal court. I waited for the applause to die down. The room grew quiet again as people returned to their expensive meals. I placed my water glass on the table with a soft clink. The sound drew my father's attention. He looked at me, his smile faltering slightly, defensive walls instantly going up. "What about my share, Dad?" I asked. My voice was completely calm, completely level. I did not ask because I wanted his money. I asked because I wanted him to say his terrible reasoning out loud in front of all these people. I wanted his cruelty on the public record. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The guests at the nearby tables stopped eating, openly eavesdropping on the family drama. My mother Diane stiffened her perfect smile, freezing into a tight grimace. She glared at me silently, begging me not to embarrass them. My father sneered, his true colors bleeding through his polished exterior. "Preston deserves it," he said, his voice hard and dismissive. "He has dedicated his life to this business. You, on the other hand, turned your back on us. When you were 18, I offered you a place in the company and you walked away, an unpaid assistant position." I corrected him smoothly, speaking loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "You wanted me to drop out of college, to fetch coffee and file paperwork for Preston for free, while you paid his full tuition and gave him an executive salary. You refused to help build this family." My father snapped, his face turning red with anger. "You chose yourself over us. You moved away, you took that corporate job, and you showed zero loyalty. So no, Hannah, you get nothing. You are not part of this family." The silence that followed was suffocating. I looked at Preston, who was grinning smugly, thoroughly enjoying my public humiliation. I looked at Kiara, who was literally suppressing a laugh behind her manicured hand. They expected me to cry. They expected me to beg, to feel crushed by the weight of being entirely cut off and disowned in front of Chicago elite. Instead, I looked at them through the lens of my profession. As a senior partner in corporate restructuring, my entire career was built on analyzing failing systems, identifying incompetent leadership, and tearing down companies that were bleeding cash. I knew my father company was struggling. I knew Preston had zero business acumen. And I knew that handing a failing empire and a massive estate to a man who could barely balance a checkbook was financial suicide. I picked up my napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and stood up from the table. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply looked at my father and smiled. "Congratulations, Preston," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent dining room. "You truly deserve each other. Good luck." I turned to walk away, fully intending to leave them to their self-congratulatory delusions. But before I could even reach the grand double doors of the dining hall, a manicured hand slammed a black leather folder against the polished wood of a nearby serving table. It was my mother. Diane stood blocking my exit, her designer gown shimmering under the crystal chandeliers. Her face was set in a hard, uncompromising line that I recognized from my childhood. It was the look she gave me whenever I failed to be the perfect accessory to her country club lifestyle. "Not so fast," she snapped, her voice lowered to a harsh whisper, so the lingering wealthy guests would not hear her behaving poorly. She slid the leather folder across the table toward me. "You are paying for this." I glanced down at the itemized receipt inside the folder. The total was staggering: $4,500. They had ordered the most expensive vintage champagne, imported caviar, premium Wagyu steaks, and multiple rounds of top-shelf cocktails to celebrate Preston getting his unearned throne. They had feasted like royalty, and now they expected the discarded daughter to foot the bill. Why exactly would I pay for a celebration I was explicitly excluded from? I asked, my tone perfectly level. I did not sound angry. I sounded bored. "Consider it back rent," Diane hissed, her eyes narrowing with raw malice. "You lived under our roof, you ate our food, and you drained our resources for 18 years before you selfishly abandoned us for your corporate career. You owe us. Pay the bill, Hannah. It is the absolute least you can do, since you refuse to contribute a single thing to the family business." Before I could formulate a response to that breathtaking level of financial delusion, a cloud of expensive, overpowering perfume announced Kiara's arrival. My sister-in-law glided over to the table, her phone still clutched in her hand, the screen glowing brightly with her social media feed. She leaned against the table, intentionally positioning her left hand so the overhead chandelier light would catch the massive sparkling diamond on her index finger. It was a new piece, easily a 5-carat emerald, cut blindingly bright and entirely unpaid for by her own labor. Kiara lived her entire life for the internet. She was a lifestyle influencer who built her brand on pretending to be old money, constantly posting videos about being a CEO wife and showing off shopping bags she could not actually afford. "Oh, come on, Hannah." Kiara drawled, her tone dripping with fake sympathy and deep condescension. "Do not be cheap. Preston just took over a massive empire tonight. We are going to be very busy running things, upgrading the estate, and taking this family to the next level of elite status. You have your little office job in the city. Just cover the dinner. It is basic etiquette when you are the least successful person in the room." I stared at the diamond on her finger. I knew for an absolute fact that Preston had put that ring on the corporate expense account just last week. I knew it because my investment firm had already run a preliminary risk assessment on their specific manufacturing sector, and I had seen the glaring red flags in their public filings. Their company was bleeding cash, their supply chain was a complete mess, their profit margins were shrinking by the quarter. Yet here was Kiara playing a billionaire on the internet, funding her lavish aesthetic with a dying company credit card. They were standing on the deck of a sinking ship, arguing over who had the best deck chair. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. Arguing with fools only drags you down to their level, and I operate on a much higher floor. Instead, I reached into my tailored blazer and pulled out my wallet. I slid a heavy matte black titanium card onto the leather folder. The American Express Centurion card. You do not just apply for a black card. You are exclusively invited. And you are only invited when your annual spending and personal net worth sit in a bracket my parents could only dream of reaching. It is a symbol of absolute, untouchable financial power. The waiter, who had been hovering nervously nearby, trying not to interrupt the family drama, saw the heavy metal card hit the table. He immediately straightened his posture, his eyes widening in instant recognition. Diane stared at the card, her perfectly Botoxed brow furrowing as she tried to process what she was looking at. She knew enough about wealth to recognize the Centurion card, but her brain was completely short-circuiting at the idea that her cast-off daughter possessed one. Kiara just rolled her eyes, entirely oblivious to the monumental financial weight sitting right in front of her face. "Charge the full amount to this," I told the waiter, maintaining direct eye contact with my mother. "And add a $1,000 tip for yourself. You have had to deal with an incredibly difficult table tonight, and you deserve to be compensated for your patience." The waiter practically bowed, swiping the folder up with deep respect. "Right away, ma'am. Thank you so much." I turned my attention back to Diane and Kiara. The smug, victorious expression on my mother's face had completely evaporated, replaced by a deep, unsettled confusion. Her eyes darted from my tailored suit to the spot where my card had just been. Kiara was busy checking her reflection in her phone screen, completely unaware that the empire she thought she had just married into was nothing but a fragile house of cards ready to collapse. "There is your back rent, Diane," I said, my voice cold and sharp enough to cut glass. "But let us get one thing perfectly clear right now. I am paying this bill not because I owe you anything, but because I can afford to throw away $5,000 on a Tuesday without even blinking. Meanwhile, you just handed the keys of your entire financial future to a man who has to put his wife's jewelry on a corporate expense account because he is functionally broke." Kiara snapped her head up, her eyes flashing with sudden anger as the insult finally registered. Diane opened her mouth to argue, her face turning an ugly, blotchy shade of red, but she had absolutely no words. The reality of my wealth, casually displayed and weaponized, had effectively silenced her. "Enjoy the vintage champagne," I added, stepping away from the table and smoothing my jacket. "And Kiara, take plenty of pictures with that new diamond ring. It will look absolutely fantastic in the bankruptcy filings. Have a wonderful evening, ladies." I turned my back on them and walked out the grand double doors of the Oakwood Country Club, leaving them standing in stunned, furious silence. The cool Chicago night air hit my face as I handed my ticket to the valet. As I slid into the driver's seat of my sleek black Porsche, I felt a deep, resonant calm wash over my entire body. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully discarded the failure of the family. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed a corporate liquidator the match to burn their entire delusional world to the ground. The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my River North penthouse, casting sharp geometric shadows across the imported hardwood floor. I was already awake, sipping black coffee and reviewing European market shifts on my tablet. My phone chimed with a priority notification. It was exactly 8 in the morning on a Sunday, the preferred hour for cowards to deliver bad news. The sender was Thomas Harrington, the senior attorney handling my family estate planning. The email was brief, dressed in heavy legal jargon, but the core message was crystal clear. By the direct and immediate order of my father Richard, my name had been officially and irrevocably removed from the family trust, the corporate succession plan, and the final will. I was completely disinherited. The attached PDF document contained the formal language, stripping me of any future claims to the manufacturing company, the country club estate, and the generational wealth they so desperately clung to. They had legally severed all ties, expecting this piece of paper to destroy my spirit. They wanted me to feel the crushing weight of rejection. Instead, I smiled. By cutting me out of the trust, my father had unknowingly eliminated the single legal conflict of interest that would have prevented my investment firm from acquiring his corporate debt. He thought he was locking me out of the castle. In reality, he had just handed me a loaded gun, removed the safety, and painted a massive target on his own front door. My phone vibrated again, this time with a barrage of text messages from a few college acquaintances and distant cousins. They were sending me screen recordings of a social media post that was rapidly gaining traction. I tapped the video thumbnail. Kiara filled the screen, perfectly contoured, wearing oversized designer sunglasses inside the Oakwood mansion. The caption floating above her head read, "Day 1 of my CEO wife era and getting rid of toxic energy." The video featured a trending hip-hop audio track layered over clips of her twirling her new emerald-cut diamond, pouring expensive champagne, and lounging on the custom Italian leather sofa my mother had purchased a decade ago. Then came the voiceover. Kiara spoke directly to the camera, her tone dripping with manufactured pity and rehearsed vulnerability. She told her 2 million followers about how hard it is to build an empire when jealous low-wage relatives try to drag you down. She painted a vivid, completely fabricated picture of a bitter salary-dependent sister-in-law who threw a massive tantrum at a country club dinner and got rightfully banished from the family estate. She made sure to emphasize the words low wage and jealous, framing herself as the victim of my supposed financial insecurities. She did not use my name, but in the tight-knit circles of the Chicago elite, she did not have to. The comment section was already a digital war zone of strangers praising Kiara for protecting her peace and brutally mocking the imaginary broke sister-in-law. The video had crossed 500,000 views in just 3 hours. It was a calculated, vicious public relations strike designed to ruin my reputation before I could even defend myself. I watched the video exactly once, locked my screen, and tossed the device into my leather tote bag. I did not leave a comment. I did not post a rebuttal. I did not call my mother to scream or cry. Lions do not lose sleep over the opinions of barking dogs. I dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, strapped on my stainless steel luxury watch, and took the private elevator down to the parking garage. As I drove my Porsche through the bustling streets of downtown Chicago, I felt a familiar cold adrenaline pumping through my veins. The city outside was loud and chaotic, but inside the soundproof cabin of my car, my mind was running complex financial algorithms. I pulled into the underground VIP parking of a sleek glass and steel skyscraper in the financial district. This was the headquarters of Vanguard Capital Group, the most notorious distressed debt and corporate restructuring fund in the Midwest. We were the apex predators of the corporate world. We bought dying companies, stripped away incompetent management, restructured the broken supply chains, and liquidated the useless assets for massive profits. I badged into the private executive elevator and rode it straight to the 40th floor. The heavy steel doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, hyper-modern office space filled with sharp, ambitious analysts and junior partners moving at breakneck speed. I walked past the glass-walled conference rooms, acknowledging the respectful nods and quick greetings of my subordinates until I reached my corner office. The view was breathtaking, offering an unobstructed panorama of the Chicago skyline and the dark waters of Lake Michigan. I had earned this view through years of ruthless efficiency, 80-hour workweeks, and flawless execution. I tossed my bag onto my expansive mahogany desk just as my senior legal partner, Bennett, walked through the open door. At 45 years old, Bennett was a legal shark, a man who navigated corporate loopholes and bankruptcy filings with terrifying precision. He dropped a thick manila folder onto my desk. He glanced at my computer screen, which was currently locked. "You are trending on the internet this morning, Hannah," he said, his voice flat and analytical. "Your sister-in-law has quite the active imagination. I assume you have seen the viral video painting you as a destitute, jealous outcast." I booted up my computer and bypassed the high-level security protocols. "I saw it," I replied without looking up. Let her enjoy her 15 minutes of internet fame. She is generating digital content, while her husband is generating catastrophic corporate debt. Social media likes do not pay commercial mortgages, Bennett. Bennett chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound that meant he was ready for a fight. He tapped the thick folder he had just placed on my desk. "Speaking of catastrophic debt, our analysts flagged something incredibly interesting during the routine market sweep this morning. It seems the newly appointed CEO of a certain manufacturing company has been very busy since he took over last night. He is already looking for fast liquidity." I stopped typing and looked at Bennett. A slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. The game had officially begun, and my brother was already walking blindly into the financial slaughterhouse. I sat back in my leather chair, ready to dive into the financial autopsy of my brother's new empire, when a sharp knock on the glass door interrupted us. David, the global director of human resources for Vanguard Capital Group, stepped into my office. He was a tall, uncompromising man who handled hiring and firing for thousands of ruthless corporate sharks. Today, however, he looked highly amused. He held his sleek mobile phone in his hand, tapping it gently against his palm. "Hannah," David said, walking over to my desk and taking a seat next to Bennett. "I just received a very disturbing, highly dramatic phone call on the Direct Human Resources executive line. It seems a concerned citizen wants to warn our firm about a dangerous criminal hiding in our senior ranks." Bennett raised an eyebrow, leaning back and crossing his arms. "A criminal? Here? That is a bold accusation. Who is the informant?" David placed his phone on the center of my mahogany desk and pressed a button. "I record all external complaints regarding senior partners," he explained smoothly. "You are going to want to hear this." He hit play. The audio was crisp, and the voice that filled my corner office was instantly recognizable. It was Diane. My mother had put on her best country club voice, the one she reserved for speaking to charity boards and domestic staff. She sounded breathless, manufacturing a tone of deep maternal distress. "Hello? Yes, I need to speak with whoever is in charge of personnel." Diane's voice echoed through the speaker. "My name is Diane, and I am calling out of a profound sense of moral duty. You have an employee named Hannah working in your offices. I am her mother, and it breaks my heart to say this, but you need to terminate her employment immediately. She is a danger to your firm." Bennett let out a short, quiet breath of disbelief. I simply rested my chin on my folded hands and listened. "She has a long, documented history of severe financial instability." Diane continued, pouring fake sorrow into every syllable. "She was just kicked out of our family estate for attempting to extort money from her brother. She has stolen family assets in the past. She is bitter, she is jealous, and she is deeply, deeply disturbed. I am warning you, because a prestigious firm like yours cannot afford the liability. She will embezzle from your clients. She will steal your corporate funds. You must fire her before she ruins your reputation." The recording ended with a soft click. David looked at me, a genuine smile breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "Well, Hannah," David said, picking up his phone. I must say your mother gives a spectacular performance. She spent another 5 minutes detailing your supposed psychological breakdowns and demanding I send security to escort you out of the building. She was entirely convinced that I would panic and fire a senior partner who brought in $40 million in revenue last quarter. I told her I would take her grave concerns directly to the executive board. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a cold, calculating focus settle over me. Diane had escalated the situation from a petty family dispute to a direct attack on my livelihood. She actually thought I was some entry-level employee sitting in a cubicle, terrified of human resources. She had absolutely no idea that I owned equity in this firm. She had no idea that trying to get me fired was like trying to fire the owner of the building. She wants to play dirty, I said, my voice devoid of any emotion. She wants to threaten my professional standing. Fine. We will give her the exact attention she is begging for. I turned my gaze to Bennett. He was already pulling a legal notepad from his briefcase, his eyes gleaming with the predatory thrill of a lawyer who just received a flawless target. Bennett. I said, my tone absolute and commanding. I want a cease and desist letter drafted right now. I want it sent via priority legal courier directly to the Oakwood estate. Require a direct signature from Richard or Diane. Bennett began writing rapidly. Defamation per se, he listed off, his voice sharp. Tortious interference with business relations. Harassment. Slander. We will hit them with the entire legal dictionary. Make it brutal, I instructed. Outline the exact legal definitions of corporate defamation in the state of Illinois. Inform them that their malicious phone call was recorded by a financial institution. Tell them that if they ever contact my firm, my clients, or my employees again, or if Kiara posts one more lying video about my financial status, I will personally file a multi-million-dollar lawsuit against them. I will sue them for damages that will force them to liquidate their cars, their jewelry, and their precious country club memberships just to afford the legal defense. Consider it done, Bennett replied, snapping his briefcase shut and standing up. I will have the final draft on your desk in 15 minutes. They are going to receive this before they even finish their afternoon tea. David nodded in agreement, taking his phone. I will instruct the reception and security teams to block all numbers associated with their estate. You have a company to run, Hannah. Let us handle the trash removal. 4 hours later, my phone vibrated with a delivery confirmation text. The legal courier had arrived at the massive iron gates of my parents' mansion. I could perfectly visualize the scene. Diane probably sitting by the pool with Kiara sipping cocktails and waiting for me to call them, crying about losing my job. Instead, the heavy oak front door would open to a stern courier handing them a thick envelope stamped with the terrifying logo of a top-tier corporate law firm. I knew exactly what that letter contained. Bennett had not held back. He had explicitly detailed the financial penalties for tortious interference, citing figures in the tens of millions. He had demanded an immediate and total retraction of any false statements made to Vanguard Capital Group. He had made it abundantly clear that they had not simply provoked a disgruntled daughter. They had provoked a corporate entity with unlimited legal resources. The fallout was immediate and deeply satisfying. For the rest of the day, my phone was completely silent. There were no frantic text messages. There were no angry voicemails from my father demanding respect. There were no new viral videos from Kiara mocking my career. The constant, arrogant noise from the Oakwood estate vanished entirely. They were terrified. The threat of a massive lawsuit, the realization that my company recorded the call, and the aggressive legal language had paralyzed them. They were cowards who hid behind their wealth, and the moment they realized they were facing someone with a bigger legal hammer, they instantly retreated into the shadows. They shut their mouths because they finally understood that one wrong move could cost them their entire lifestyle. They thought the silence would protect them. They thought if they just ignored the cease and desist letter and stayed quiet, the storm would pass. They had no idea that their silence was exactly what I needed. While they were busy hiding from a defamation lawsuit, they were completely distracted from the real threat. They were so terrified of me as a daughter that they forgot to fear me as a corporate liquidator. And while they sat quietly in their mansion, Preston was actively destroying their company from the inside out, signing his name on the very documents I would soon use to take everything they owned. 6 months vanished into the brutal chill of a Chicago winter. Inside the climate-controlled walls of Vanguard Capital Group, my portfolio had grown by another 20%. I was busy dismantling real corporate threats and multiplying my personal wealth. But across town, inside the aging brick headquarters of my father manufacturing empire, a very different kind of dismantling was taking place. The kind that happens when you hand the keys of a high-speed vehicle to a toddler who has only ever played with toy cars. Preston was drowning. He had taken over the CEO office, ordered a custom mahogany desk, and immediately decided he was the smartest man in the industry. Fueled by a lifetime of unearned praise and absolute arrogance, he wanted to prove he could increase profit margins faster than my father ever did. His brilliant strategy was to fire the veteran supply chain directors who had kept the company running for 3 decades, claiming their salaries were an unnecessary drain on his new empire. In their place, he signed a series of catastrophic contracts with cheap, unvetted overseas vendors that he found through a random networking event. The results were immediate and devastating. The raw materials arrived weeks late and failed basic quality control inspections. Manufacturing lines ground to a halt. Furious clients began canceling their orders and activating heavy financial penalty clauses for breach of contract. The company cash reserves, which my father had meticulously built over 40 years, began bleeding out at an astonishing rate. Preston was hemorrhaging money faster than the accounting department could track, but his ego refused to allow him to admit defeat. While the factory floors were descending into chaos, Kiara was treating the corporate account like her personal piggy bank. She fully embraced her delusional role as a billionaire wife, completely disconnected from the reality of her husband failing business. Winter had arrived, which meant Kiara required a highly documented, incredibly expensive vacation to Aspen to maintain her social media dominance. She swiped the company platinum card with reckless abandon. She chartered a private jet for her and her influencer friends, racking up a $50,000 flight bill in a single afternoon. She rented a luxury ski chalet that cost more per night than most of the factory workers made in a month. Her social media feeds were flooded with videos of her unboxing rare Hermes Birkin bags in the snow, sipping $1,000 bottles of champagne, and boasting about the limitless perks of generational wealth. Every single swipe of that heavy metal card sent a massive invoice directly to Preston's desk, piling up right next to the mounting lawsuits from angry distributors. Preston was trapped in a financial nightmare of his own making. He was bleeding cash on the factory floor and hemorrhaging capital through his wife's designer shopping habits. A smart businessman would have halted the spending, admitted his mistakes, and asked the board of directors for emergency guidance. But Preston was not a smart businessman. He was a fragile narcissist, terrified of losing his golden child status. He knew that if Richard found out the company was failing after only 6 months, the illusion of his superiority would shatter. My father still spent his afternoons at the Oakwood Country Club smoking cigars and bragging to his wealthy friends about his genius son taking the industry by storm. Preston could not bear the humiliation of proving me right. So he did what all cowards do when backed into a corner. He started lying to everyone. Preston locked himself in his executive office late at night and began committing textbook corporate fraud. He manipulated the internal financial software, intentionally misclassifying operating expenses as capital investments. He shifted massive liabilities into obscure shell accounts and falsely inflated projected revenue streams to make the balance sheets look healthy. He booked revenue for contracts that had already been canceled. He cooked the books with the clumsy desperation of a man who had no idea how sophisticated financial audits actually worked. He printed out these fabricated glossy reports and handed them directly to my father during their weekly family dinners, smiling widely, while Richard patted him on the back and praised his business acumen. They were living inside a spectacular illusion. Diane was busy hosting charity galas, boasting about her successful son. Kiara was busy trying on diamond necklaces in Aspen, utterly convinced her husband was a corporate titan. Richard was busy resting on his laurels, completely blind to the fact that his legacy was being hollowed out from the inside. And Preston was sweating through his designer suits, desperately trying to keep the entire fraudulent structure from collapsing on top of him. He thought he was being clever. He thought he could hide the bleeding just long enough to secure a new line of credit and fix the mess before anyone noticed. He assumed that because the internal accountants reported directly to him, his forged ledgers would never see the light of day. He truly believed he was untouchable. But corporate debt always leaves a trail. Unpaid invoices create ripples in the financial sector. When a legacy manufacturing firm suddenly stops paying its vendors and starts begging secondary lenders for high-interest cash injections, the sharks in the water smell the blood immediately. I was sitting at my desk at Vanguard Capital, reviewing a fresh stack of distressed debt portfolios that our analysts had flagged for potential acquisition. The financial market in Chicago is a small, tightly connected web, and secrets do not stay hidden for long when millions of dollars are missing. I took a sip of my black coffee and opened the first heavy file. It was a preliminary risk assessment report on regional manufacturing defaults. My eyes scanned the data, tracing the sharp, undeniable downward graph of a company in a fatal tailspin. The numbers were brutal. Late payments breached contracts, massive leverage ratios, and a desperate pattern of securing predatory loans just to make payroll. I looked at the name of the parent company printed in bold letters at the top of the page. It was my father company. Preston had not just ruined the business. He had driven it straight to the edge of a cliff, tied an anvil to its bumper, and pushed it over. And now the wreckage was landing perfectly on my desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the financial death warrant of the family that had discarded me. The pieces were finally falling into place, and I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy them. They had done all the heavy lifting entirely by themselves. In the corporate restructuring world, we have a fundamental rule. You can manipulate your balance sheets, you can forge your revenue projections, and you can lie to your board of directors, but you absolutely cannot fake cash. Cash is oxygen. And by the end of the first quarter, Preston was suffocating. The vendors he had blindly contracted were demanding payment up front. The shipping companies were holding critical materials hostage at the docks because the company credit accounts were maxed out. Payroll was looming like a guillotine. Preston sat in my father's executive office, staring at a computer screen that displayed a catastrophic deficit. His customized mahogany desk was buried under past due notices and aggressive letters from collection agencies. He had successfully cooked the books to impress our parents, but fake numbers do not deposit real dollars into a banking account. To make matters exponentially worse, his phone buzzed with a fresh notification. It was a text from his wife. Kiara had just swiped the company platinum card again this time for a $15,000 Cartier watch she claimed was a vital business expense for her influencer brand. She sent a selfie from a luxury boutique, completely oblivious to the fact that her husband was currently trying to figure out how to pay the factory workers by Friday. The pressure was crushing him, reducing him to a panicked, desperate amateur. Preston knew he could not go to a traditional bank. Any legitimate underwriter would take one look at his chaotic supply chain, his inflated revenue models, and his toxic debt-to-income ratio, and they would laugh him out of the building. He was legally radioactive to the standard financial sector. But Preston needed a massive cash injection, and he needed it immediately to keep the illusion alive. When traditional doors close, the shadow banking sector opens its jaws. Preston reached out to a mezzanine lending firm, a predatory financial institution that specializes in high-risk, hard money loans. These lenders do not care about your business plan. They do not care about your cash flow projections. They only care about one thing: hard, tangible collateral. They want assets they can legally seize and liquidate the second you miss a payment. When Preston sat down with the loan sharks in their dimly lit downtown office, he tried to leverage the company manufacturing equipment. The lenders dismissed him instantly. The machinery was outdated, rapidly depreciating, and virtually worthless in a quick liquidation sale. They demanded something real. They demanded real estate. This is where my father, monumental arrogance, sealed his own fate. When Richard hosted that grand coronation dinner at the Oakwood Country Club, he did not just hand Preston the CEO title. He was so utterly convinced of his son's absolute genius that he transferred the entirety of the family assets into a singular trust, naming Preston as the sole managing trustee. That included the deed to the $2.8 million Oakwood estate. The sprawling, perfectly manicured mansion where my parents currently slept was legally under Preston's absolute control. The lenders knew this. They ran the property records. They slid a thick stack of contracts across the table, offering Preston a multi-million-dollar bridge loan to cover his corporate operating costs. But the catch was a financial death sentence. It was a cross-collateralized loan. In simple terms, a cross-collateralized loan ties multiple assets together to secure a single debt. The lender explicitly tied the commercial debt of the failing manufacturing company directly to the residential deed of the Oakwood estate. If the company missed a single payment, the lender had the immediate legal right to bypass the business, entirely seize the residential mansion, and evict my parents to recover their funds. And the interest rate attached to this toxic agreement was a staggering 22%. It was a deal designed to fail. It was a trap built for a fool. Preston hesitated, staring at the signature line. He knew the risk. He knew he was putting a target directly on the roof over our parents' heads. But the narcissism of the golden child took over. He rationalized the crime in his own mind. He convinced himself it was just a temporary bridge loan. He told himself he would fix the supply chain, double the profit margins, and pay off the predatory debt in 3 months before anyone ever found out. He believed his own lies. With a trembling hand and sweat pooling at his collar, Preston signed his name on the dotted line. He legally mortgaged our parents' home to fund his own incompetence and his wife's shopping addiction. He took the cash, plugged the bleeding holes in his corporate accounts, and walked out of the lending office feeling like a victorious titan of industry. Meanwhile, completely blind to the financial guillotine hanging over their necks, Richard and Diane were living their best lives. At the exact moment Preston was signing away their home, my father was holding court at the Oakwood Country Club. He was buying expensive rounds of scotch for his golf buddies, loudly boasting about his son's aggressive corporate expansion and unparalleled business instincts. He puffed on premium cigars, telling anyone who would listen that transferring the empire to Preston was the smartest move he had ever made. Diane was sitting poolside with the other wealthy wives, showing off glossy photos of Kiara's glamorous Aspen vacation. She proudly detailed how the company was thriving under new leadership, entirely convinced that her family was ascending to a new tier of elite society. They slept peacefully in their custom king-sized bed that night, surrounded by imported Italian linens and antique furniture, feeling utterly secure in their generational wealth. They had absolutely no idea that the very walls around them, the roof over their heads, and the ground they walked on no longer belonged to them. They were merely trespassing in a mansion that was now legally owned by shadow bankers, all because they chose to blindly trust the heir they had built from a foundation of pure delusion. And worst of all, they had no idea that those toxic, cross-collateralized loan documents were about to be bundled, sold on the secondary distressed debt market, and dropped directly onto my mahogany desk. The secondary market for distressed corporate debt is a graveyard of broken egos and failed ambitions. At Vanguard Capital Group, we do not view these financial failures with sympathy. We view them as raw materials. When a company begins its final death spiral, the predatory lenders who issued their last resort loans often panic. They realize the business is going to completely implode, tying up their capital in years of messy bankruptcy litigation. To avoid the legal headache, these shadow banks bundle their most toxic loans into massive portfolios and sell them off to institutional buyers like us at a steep discount. We buy the debt, and by legal extension, we become the absolute masters of the debtor fate. It was a Tuesday morning, exactly 3 weeks after my firm sent the cease and desist letter to my parents. The trading floor outside my glass office was a symphony of ringing phones and aggressive negotiations. I was sitting at my mahogany desk analyzing a newly acquired portfolio of commercial real estate defaults when Bennett walked through my door. He was carrying a sealed red bordered folder, the universal internal code for a Tier 4 distressed asset package. These were the high-risk, high-reward liquidations that required senior partner approval. Bennett tossed the heavy folder onto the center of my desk. He did not say a word, but the slight predatory glint in his eye told me this was not a standard acquisition file. He poured himself a cup of black coffee from the carafe on the sideboard and sat in the leather chair opposite me, waiting in total silence. I broke the seal on the folder and opened the thick stack of financial documents. The portfolio was a blind auction bundle from a notorious mezzanine lending group based on the East Coast. They were desperately trying to offload $50 million in toxic corporate paper before the end of the fiscal quarter. I flipped through the first dozen pages with practice speed, scanning the asset classes. There were the usual victims of poor management: a collapsed logistics firm in Detroit, a bankrupt retail chain in Minneapolis, a failed commercial development in Cleveland. Then my finger stopped on page 42. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I stared at the bold black ink printed across the top of the default summary. I read the legal name of the manufacturing corporation. I read the tax identification number. I read the registered address of the corporate headquarters. It was my father company. I kept my face entirely impassive, but my mind was moving at the speed of light. I looked at the specific loan details. The primary debt was a massive short-term commercial bridge loan with a staggering 22% interest rate. It had been issued a mere 2 months ago, and the debtor was already 90 days delinquent on the secondary payment structures. The company was in a state of terminal, unrecoverable default. But that was not the detail that made my heart race with cold, calculated exhilaration. I moved my eyes down to the collateral section of the lending agreement. In standard corporate loans, the collateral is tied to heavy machinery, intellectual property, or warehouse real estate. But the text in this specific clause made me lean closer to the page. It was a cross-collateralized security agreement. I traced my manicured fingernail along the printed lines, reading the exact property address that Preston had legally bound to this toxic debt. It was the Oakwood estate, the $2.8 million mansion, the sprawling, perfectly manicured property where my mother hosted her elite charity dinners, the house where my father puffed his premium cigars and bragged about his generational wealth, the very same dining room where I had been told I was a failure, a disappointment, and an outsider who did not belong to their dynasty. Preston had legally mortgaged the very roof over our parents' heads to cover up his catastrophic supply chain failures and his wife-designer shopping sprees. He had handed the deed of the family castle to a group of shadow bankers, and now those bankers were placing that exact deed directly onto my desk. While I sat in my penthouse office holding the legal right to seize their home, I could vividly imagine what they were doing at this exact moment. Kiara was likely walking down the magnificent mile, swiping the company platinum card for another luxury handbag, completely oblivious that the very plastic in her hand was funded by the destruction of her own residence. Diane was probably planning her next lavish garden party, selecting floral arrangements for a yard that no longer belonged to her husband. And my father was undoubtedly at the country club bragging about his genius son. The sheer, breathtaking irony of their delusion fueled my focus. I looked up from the document and met Bennett's gaze. He was watching me intently, his coffee cup suspended in midair. He knew the name of the company. He knew the address of the residential collateral. As my senior legal partner, he knew exactly whose financial execution warrant I was currently holding in my hands. Bennett lowered his cup. I saw the address, he said, his voice dropping to a low, serious register. The mezzanine lender bundled it into this regional package to dump it fast. The son signed the cross-collateralization agreement as the sole managing trustee of the family estate. He tied the commercial default directly to the residential property. It is a legal masterpiece of absolute unfiltered stupidity. If we acquire this portfolio, we hold the primary lien on the corporation and the mansion. I looked back down at the signature line on the final page of the contract. There it was. Preston's signature scrawled in arrogant, messy ink. He had signed away his golden child inheritance for a few months of fake liquidity. He had metaphorically drenched his parents' entire lifestyle in gasoline, and the universe had just handed me the match. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of joy or vindictive rage. It was the smile of a chess player who just realized her opponent had moved his king into an inescapable trap. For 33 years, I had been the scapegoat, the outcast, the daughter who was never good enough to sit at the head of their table. They had actively tried to ruin my career. They had publicly humiliated me. They had demanded I pay for their celebrations while they handed my brother an empire. And now, through their own blind arrogance and Preston's staggering incompetence, they had delivered their entire empire right into my hands. Hannah Bennett asked, breaking the silence in the office. How do you want to proceed with this package? The bidding closes in 48 hours. I closed the red-bordered folder and rested my hands flat against the smooth leather cover. The cold logic of corporate warfare completely took over. I was no longer the discarded daughter. I was the apex predator they had accidentally invited into their home. "We are going to buy it," I told Bennett, my voice sharp, steady, and devoid of any mercy. "We are going to buy the entire debt portfolio, every single cent of it. But we cannot acquire it directly under Vanguard Capital Group. If my father or Preston see this firm name on the acquisition papers, they will panic and attempt to file for emergency bankruptcy protection to stall the foreclosure. We need to blindside them. We need to let them bleed out until they have no legal maneuvers left. We need a legal ghost," I told Bennett, tracing the edge of the red folder. "If we buy this under Vanguard Capital Group, my father will see the firm name on the transfer notices. He will immediately connect the dots to me. He will panic, call his country club lawyers, and file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection just to freeze the assets. I refuse to give him the luxury of a warning. I want them completely blind until the moment the floor collapses underneath them." Bennett leaned forward, steepling his fingers. His mind was already constructing the corporate labyrinth. "You want to establish a blind trust, an entity completely insulated from your public identity. We structure it in Delaware utilizing proxy directors. On paper, it will look like a faceless, aggressive institutional debt buyer. They will have absolutely no idea that the apex predator holding their leash is sitting in this exact office." "Exactly," I replied, my voice steady. "And we are not using Vanguard Capital for this acquisition. I am buying this debt personally." Bennett raised an eyebrow. "The total face value of the outstanding loan is $12 million, Hannah. Even on the secondary distressed market, the mezzanine lender will want at least $4 million to offload it. That is a massive personal liquidity play." I opened my laptop and logged into my private wealth management portal. I have spent the last decade tearing apart failing companies and earning massive performance bonuses while they spent their money maintaining a country club facade. $4 million is a fraction of my liquid portfolio. I will authorize the wire transfer by noon. Go draft the incorporation papers. Let us call the trust Obsidian Financial Management. It sounds generic, corporate, and entirely ruthless. For the next 48 hours, my corner office operated like a war room. Bennett mobilized his best junior associates, swearing them to strict confidentiality. They worked through the night filing the expedited incorporation documents in Delaware, establishing the proxy directors, and opening the shadow banking accounts. Obsidian Financial Management was born on paper, a perfectly legal, heavily armored corporate ghost designed for one specific purpose. Once the entity was established, Bennett initiated contact with the mezzanine lender on the East Coast. The negotiation was swift and brutal. The shadow bankers were absolutely desperate to wipe Preston's toxic cross-collateralized loan off their quarterly books. They knew the manufacturing company was plunging toward insolvency, and they had zero desire to enter a prolonged, messy foreclosure battle over a residential mansion in Illinois. Bennett offered them $3.2 million in pure cash for the entire $12 million debt package. It was a humiliating discount, but the lenders took it instantly. They prioritized fast liquidity over long-term legal warfare. They signed the assignment of debt, packed the original promissory notes into a secure courier pouch, and transferred the legal titles. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Bennett walked into my office and placed a sleek black leather binder on my desk. The transaction had cleared. The wire transfers were confirmed. "It is done," Bennett said, a rare, genuine smile crossing his face. "Obsidian Financial Management is now the supreme secured creditor for the entire corporate entity. You hold the primary lien on the factory, the commercial supply chain assets, and the residential deed to the Oakwood estate. Legally speaking, you own them." I opened the binder and stared at the original loan documents. I looked at the signature line where Preston had carelessly scrawled his name, blindly mortgaging our parents' home. I traced my finger over the fresh assignment stamp that legally transferred all that power directly to my blind trust. The feeling that washed over me was not explosive joy or petty vindication. It was profound, absolute control. For 33 years, my parents had dictated my worth. They had treated me like a disposable asset, demanding I serve my brother, telling me I was a failure when I refused. They believed their wealth made them untouchable. But wealth is only power if you know how to structure it. I had just purchased their entire reality for pennies on the dollar, and they were completely oblivious. At that exact moment, a notification would be arriving in the mailbox of the Oakwood estate and the executive office of the manufacturing company. A standard, highly impersonal corporate letter informing them that their debt had been sold to a new servicing entity named Obsidian Financial Management. I could picture Preston sitting at his oversized desk, reading that letter and feeling a temporary wave of relief. In his sheer financial ignorance, he would assume that a change in creditors bought him more time. He would think this faceless new corporation would take months to audit his files, giving him the breathing room he needed to hide his catastrophic supply chain failures. He would probably lean back in his chair feeling like a genius who had just dodged a bullet. I could picture Kiara receiving the mail at the mansion, tossing the legal notice aside without a second glance to focus on unboxing her latest designer shoes. I could picture my father at the golf course continuing to boast about his legacy, completely unaware that a corporate guillotine was hovering inches above his neck. They thought they were dealing with a standard bureaucratic bank that would negotiate terms and offer restructuring plans. They did not know that Obsidian Financial Management had zero interest in negotiations. They did not know that their new creditor was the very daughter they had publicly humiliated and discarded. "Let them enjoy their weekend," I told Bennett, closing the black leather binder and locking it inside my secure desk drawer. "Let them spend money they do not have. Let Preston keep fabricating his accounting reports. We will give them exactly enough rope to hang themselves. When the first payment defaults under the new trust, we will not send a warning letter. We will drop the sky on them." Bennett nodded, gathering his things. "You are the apex predator now, Hannah. They are just waiting for the strike." I turned my chair to face the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the sprawling, icy skyline of Chicago. The game was entirely rigged in my favor now. I held the deed to their home. I held the leash to their company. The trap was perfectly set, the steel jaws pulled back and locked into place. All I had to do was sit in my corner office, drink my coffee, and wait for my arrogant, incompetent brother to take one final fatal step. The corporate illusion Preston had so desperately constructed shattered on a Tuesday morning. It did not happen with a slow leak, but with a catastrophic explosion. The independent auditing firm hired to review the quarterly financials finally bypassed his forged internal reports and requested direct verification from the overseas vendors. What they found was a financial bloodbath. The auditors immediately flagged the accounts. Within hours, the news leaked across the industry. The overseas suppliers who had been fed empty promises and bounced checks for months coordinated a massive strike. They froze every single shipping container sitting at the docks. They ordered cargo ships to turn around mid-ocean. They completely severed the supply chain. Inside the manufacturing headquarters, the production lines ground to a sudden deafening halt. Hundreds of factory workers stood around in confused silence as the raw materials simply stopped arriving. Up in the executive suite, Preston was experiencing a full-blown panic attack. He paced behind his custom mahogany desk, his designer shirt soaked with sweat. His phone rang incessantly. Angry distributors demanded answers. Regional managers screamed about breached contracts. The legal department sent frantic emails about incoming lawsuits. Preston ignored all of them. He stared at his computer screen, watching the company's stock value and cash reserves plummet to absolute zero. He had played a dangerous game of financial roulette, and the house had just taken everything. While Preston was suffocating under the weight of his own incompetence, his wife was experiencing a very different kind of crisis across town. Kiara was strutting down Oak Street, the premier luxury shopping district in Chicago. She was surrounded by her usual entourage of local influencers, holding her phone high to record her latest shopping spree. She walked into an exclusive designer boutique, heading straight for a limited edition leather handbag that cost more than a reliable used car. She made a grand show of handing the pristine company platinum card to the sales associate, smiling for her camera as she boasted about the perks of being married to a corporate titan. The sales associate swiped the card. The machine beeped, flashing a bright red error message. The associate frowned, attempting to process the transaction a second time. Another red error. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the associate said, maintaining a tight, polite smile. "The card has been declined." Kiara lowered her phone, her perfectly contoured face twisting in sudden outrage. "Declined? That is impossible. Run it again. You must be doing something wrong. This is an unlimited corporate account." The associate tried one final time before turning the screen to show her the fatal message. "The bank has placed a hard freeze on this account, ma'am. Do you have another form of payment?" The other shoppers in the quiet high-end boutique turned to look. Kiara's friends exchanged awkward, judgmental glances. The illusion of her limitless wealth popped right there in the middle of the store. Her face flushed with a violent mix of embarrassment and fury. She snatched the useless plastic from the counter, practically vibrating with rage, and stormed out of the boutique without saying another word. She dialed Preston's number, immediately ready to tear him apart for humiliating her in front of her audience. That evening, the Oakwood estate transformed from a peaceful suburban sanctuary into a chaotic war zone. The heavy oak doors of the mansion slammed shut as Kiara marched into the grand foyer, screaming Preston's name at the top of her lungs. Preston had just arrived home, looking like a man walking to his own execution. Kiara threw the dead platinum card directly at his chest. "You humiliated me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. "My card declined. I was standing in front of everyone, and the machine said the account was frozen. What kind of CEO lets his wife get embarrassed like a commoner? Fix it right now." Preston backed away, running a trembling hand through his hair. "I cannot fix it, Kiara. The accounts are frozen. The suppliers cut us off. The auditors flagged the discrepancies. We have no money." The sheer volume of their screaming drew my parents out of the formal living room. Richard and Diane rushed into the foyer, their faces painted with shock and confusion. Diane clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting between her golden boy and his furious wife. "What on earth is going on here?" Richard demanded, using his deepest, most authoritative voice. "Why is the company account frozen? Preston explained this immediately." Preston looked at his father, the man who had handed him a legacy he was completely unqualified to manage. The walls were closing in, and Preston finally broke. The truth poured out in a pathetic, stammering confession. He admitted to firing the veteran supply chain directors. He admitted to signing garbage contracts with unvetted overseas vendors. He confessed that the production lines had stopped. The cash reserves were gone, and the company was currently facing millions of dollars in breach of contract lawsuits. Diane gasped, taking a step back, as if physically struck by the words. Kiara stood frozen, the reality of her collapsing lifestyle finally registering in her mind. Richard's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. For a moment, the harsh truth of his terrible judgment hung heavily in the air. He had handed his life work to a fool. He had disowned his highly capable daughter to prop up an incompetent son. Any rational businessman would have immediately fired Preston, seized control of the remaining assets, and called a crisis management team. But Richard's ego was far too fragile to accept his own massive failure. Acknowledging that Preston destroyed the company meant acknowledging that I was right all along. It meant admitting he was wrong in front of his wife, his daughter-in-law, and the entire Chicago elite. Richard swallowed his pride and chose delusion. He grabbed Preston by the shoulders, his grip tight and desperate. "We are going to fix this," Richard commanded, his voice shaking with forced confidence. "You are my son. You are a brilliant businessman. This is just a temporary cash flow problem caused by bad vendors. We will spin the narrative. We will restructure the debt. Nobody outside this family needs to know the extent of this issue. But Dad." Preston whimpered, his voice cracking. "The debt. It is massive." "I do not care," Richard barked, refusing to look at the reality of the situation. "We protect the family name at all costs. I will call some favors. I will call the banks. We are not losing this company." He was so blinded by his need to protect his golden child that he did not even think to ask how Preston had managed to keep the company afloat for the last 2 months. He did not ask what collateral Preston had used to secure the secret bridge loans. Richard was entirely focused on saving his pride completely, unaware that his beloved son had already signed away the very marble floor they were currently standing on. The ship was already underwater, and my father was just politely asking the crew to ignore the drowning. The following afternoon, my private cell phone vibrated against the polished glass of my office desk. I was in the middle of reviewing the final, legally binding transfer documents for Obsidian Financial Management. I glanced at the glowing screen and stopped. The caller identification displayed my father's name. It was the first time Richard had attempted to contact me directly since the night he stood in front of the Chicago elite and proudly declared I was no longer a part of his family. I let the phone buzz 3 times. I considered ignoring it entirely, letting his desperation ring out into the void. But a deep clinical curiosity took over. I wanted to hear the exact sound of a drowning man who was desperately trying to convince everyone he was simply going for a swim. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, remaining completely silent. Hannah Richard barked through the speaker. There was no greeting. There was no hesitation. There was absolutely zero apology for publicly disowning me at the country club, and certainly no remorse for my mother's psychotic attempt to have me terminated from my firm. He spoke with the harsh, demanding tone of a commanding officer addressing a disobedient foot soldier. "We have a slight logistical bottleneck at the headquarters," my father announced, using sanitized corporate buzzwords to mask what was undoubtedly a total operational collapse. He cleared his throat, trying to project total control. "Some of our overseas vendors have become entirely unreasonable. They have temporarily frozen our inbound shipments due to a minor clerical misunderstanding on Preston end. They are threatening to cancel the supply contracts over a simple delayed invoice." The sheer breathtaking audacity of the man was almost impressive. He was calling the daughter he threw away, fully expecting me to drop everything and clean up his golden boy mess. "You have high-level connections in the commercial logistics sector," Richard ordered, slipping effortlessly back into his dictatorial patriarch persona. "I need you to make a few calls today. Leverage your firm reputation. Get hold of the directors at these supply companies. Tell them the corporation is perfectly solvent and force them to reopen our credit lines immediately. Preston is far too busy managing the macro strategy of the expansion to deal with these petty, low-level vendor disputes." I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and let out a short, hollow laugh. The delusion was terminal. He actually believed his own fabricated reality. "Let me get this completely straight," I said, my voice dropping to a freezing analytical baseline. "You publicly disown me. Your wife tries to destroy my career with a fraudulent phone call to my human resources department. And now you have the nerve to call my personal phone and demand that I commit corporate fraud by vouching for a company that is currently in a state of unrecoverable insolvency." "It is not insolvent." Richard snapped, his temper instantly flaring at my absolute refusal to comply. "It is a temporary cash flow hiccup. We are restructuring our accounts payable." "It is a stage 4 financial hemorrhage," Richard Y fired back, deliberately stripping him of his parental title. "Your genius heir bypassed standard procurement protocols and signed net 30 contracts with unvetted Tier 3 offshore manufacturers. He completely destroyed your working capital ratio. He breached all primary debt covenants and triggered cross-default clauses across the entire global supply chain. He did not have a clerical misunderstanding. He drove your legacy straight into a brick wall because he does not understand basic unit economics." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy and suffocating. It was filled with the sudden, terrifying realization that I knew exactly what was happening inside his closed executive doors. "How do you know all of that?" Richard demanded, his voice dropping an octave, the false confidence finally cracking. "Because I am a professional liquidator," I answered smoothly, enjoying the sharp intake of breath on his end. "I smell rotting companies from a mile away. Preston has zero liquidity. The suppliers cut you off because your corporate credit rating is currently garbage. No magical phone call from me is going to deposit the millions of dollars you owe them. Furthermore, I am not going to burn my pristine professional reputation to cover up the fact that your son is functionally illiterate when it comes to supply chain management." Richard's pride forcefully took over, blinding him to the very real danger he was in. His breathing grew heavy, echoing through the phone speaker. "You listen to me right now, young lady," Richard growled, his anger escalating into a familiar, booming rage. "This is your family. You will pick up the phone, you will call those distributors, and you will fix your brother's supply line today. I do not care what happened at the country club. I am still the head of this family, and I demand some respect. You owe us your loyalty." He was building up to a massive, screaming lecture. It was the exact kind of verbal abuse I had endured for my entire life. He was preparing to tear me down, to make me feel small, to remind me that my only value was serving his chosen heir. But the power dynamic had permanently shifted. I was no longer a captive audience to his delusions. I was holding the deed to his house in my desk drawer. "You have exactly zero authority here," I said quietly, my voice slicing effortlessly through his rising temper. "You chose your successor. Now you get to watch him sink the ship. Tell Preston to buy a bucket because no one is coming to save you. Do not you dare hang up on me, Hannah. I swear to God I will make you regret." I moved my finger and pressed the red button on my screen. The line went instantly dead, cutting off his empty, pathetic threat mid-sentence. I tossed the phone onto my desk and picked up my pen, returning to the legal documents in front of me. A profound sense of tranquility washed over my office. The conversation was officially over. He had demanded respect without offering any, and I had responded by shutting the door in his face. It was the last time my father would ever try to give me an order. The countdown to their total destruction had just accelerated, and I did not have to do a single thing but sit back and watch them drown in the flood they had created. The morning sun bathed the Oakwood estate in a deceptively peaceful golden light. Diane was sipping her imported tea in the grand foyer, dressed in a silk robe, admiring the fresh floral arrangements delivered just an hour ago. She was actively ignoring the tension that had suffocated the house since the company credit cards started declining. In her mind, Richard was handling it. Richard always handled it. The heavy brass knocker on the custom oak front door sounded echoing sharply through the marble corridors. Diane expected a courier delivering Kiara latest designer shoes, or perhaps a neighbor dropping off a country club gala invitation. She placed her porcelain teacup on a silver tray and opened the door with a practiced, welcoming smile. That smile vanished instantly. Standing on her immaculate front porch was not a delivery driver. It was a uniformed county sheriff accompanied by a court-appointed process server. The sheriff held a thick stack of legal documents attached to a heavy clipboard. He did not return her smile. He looked at the sprawling mansion with the tired, indifferent eyes of a man who evicted bankrupt millionaires for a living. "Are you Diane the sheriff?" asked his voice entirely devoid of country club politeness. Diane instinctively clutched the collar of her silk robe, her heart rate accelerating. "Yes, I am. What is the meaning of this? Why is there a police cruiser parked in my circular driveway?" The process server stepped forward, handing her a thick, legally binding packet of papers. The front page was printed with bold, terrifying black ink that cut through her wealthy delusions like a physical blade. "Notice of foreclosure and intent to seize property. You have been officially served," the sheriff stated flatly. "The primary creditor, Obsidian Financial Management, has executed an accelerated foreclosure due to critical default on a cross-collateralized commercial bridge loan. Your residential deed was listed as the primary security asset. You and all occupants have a legally mandated window to vacate the premises before the locks are changed, and the property is seized for auction. Have a good day, ma'am." The sheriff turned and walked back to his cruiser, leaving Diane standing frozen in the open doorway. The crisp morning breeze swept into the foyer, but Diane felt entirely numb. Her trembling hands gripped the legal packet. She forced her eyes to read the horrifying legal jargon. She saw the name of the Family Manufacturing Corporation. She saw the staggering $12 million debt figure. And then her eyes locked onto the signature line at the very bottom of the asset forfeiture agreement. It was Preston's signature. The realization hit her nervous system like a freight train. Her golden boy, the genius heir they had sacrificed their daughter for, had secretly mortgaged the very floor she was standing on. The walls of the $2.8 million estate seemed to cave in on her. The air vanished from her lungs. Diane let out a sharp, choked gasp, her knees giving out completely. She collapsed onto the imported marble tiles, the foreclosure notice slipping from her hands as she fainted dead away in her own grand foyer. The dull thud of her fall echoed up the sweeping spiral staircase. Richard, who was in the middle of tying his silk necktie in the master suite, heard the noise and hurried out to the landing. He looked over the mahogany railing and saw his wife sprawled unconscious on the floor, the front door wide open to the neighborhood. "Diane!" Richard shouted, rushing down the stairs with a frantic urgency. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulders. "Diane, wake up!" As he checked her pulse, his eyes fell upon the thick legal packet scattered across the tiles. The bold letters screamed up at him. "Foreclosure." He snatched the papers off the floor, his eyes darting frantically across the paragraphs. Richard was a businessman. He knew exactly what a cross-collateralized loan meant. He saw the predatory 22% interest rate. He saw the immediate seizure clauses. And just like his wife, he saw the undeniable damning signature of his beloved son. The blood drained from Richard's face, only to return a second later in a violent boiling rush of crimson fury. The company was not just struggling, it was completely dead. And Preston had dragged their personal sanctuary into the grave with it. "Preston!" Richard roared, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers. The sound was not a father calling his son. It was the roar of a patriarch who had just realized he had been played for an absolute fool. "Preston, get down here right now!" Upstairs, a door opened hesitantly. Preston stepped out of his suite wearing expensive silk pajamas, his face pale and terrified. He had heard the sheriff vehicle outside. He knew what day it was. The grace period for the bridge loan had officially expired at midnight. "What is going on?" Preston stammered, gripping the railing as he slowly descended the stairs, looking at his mother unconscious on the floor, and his father gripping a stack of legal papers. Richard stood up, his massive frame shaking with uncontrollable rage. He closed the distance between him and his son in 3 rapid, heavy strides. Preston opened his mouth to formulate another pathetic excuse, to spin another lie about supply chains and temporary cash flow issues. He never got the words out. Richard raised his hand and delivered a vicious open-handed slap directly across Preston's face. The sharp crack echoed through the cavernous foyer. The force of the blow sent Preston stumbling backward, crashing hard against the decorative wooden paneling of the staircase. "You mortgaged my house?" Richard screamed, spit flying from his lips, his eyes wide with a terrifying, unhinged betrayal. "You put my home, the estate I built with my bare hands, as collateral for a shadow bank loan. You lied to my face. You sat at my dinner table and handed me forged accounting reports while you secretly handed the deed of my house to predatory liquidators." "Dad, I can fix it," Preston whimpered, holding his stinging cheek cowering against the wall like a frightened child. "The vendors screwed us. The auditors panicked. I just needed a bridge loan to cover payroll. I was going to pay it back before you ever found out." "You are a worthless, incompetent fool," Richard roared, kicking the wooden banister. "You did not just bankrupt the company. You made us homeless. Obsidian Financial Management is seizing this property. We have nothing." The commotion had finally woken Kiara. She appeared at the top of the stairs, wrapping a custom silk robe around her waist. She looked down at the chaotic scene, her perfectly curated influencer aesthetic clashing violently with the brutal reality unfolding below her. She saw her mother-in-law passed out on the floor. She saw her husband cowering with a red handprint across his face. "Why is everyone screaming?" Kiara demanded, her voice shrill and annoyed. "I am trying to edit a brand deal video. What is going on?" Richard glared up at her, the absolute disgust for his daughter-in-law finally breaking through his polite country club filter. "Pack your designer bags, Kiara." Richard snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "Your brilliant husband just lost the company and the house. A bank is coming to change the locks. You are being evicted." Kiara froze. Her eyes widened as the words slowly penetrated her delusional reality. She looked at Preston, waiting for him to confidently deny it, to tell his father he was overreacting, to assure her that her billionaire lifestyle was perfectly secure. Preston could not even meet her eyes. He looked down at the marble floor, completely defeated. "No," Kiara shrieked, a high-pitched, desperate wail that sounded like a dying animal. "No. This is my house. I just ordered custom Italian drapes for the screening room. You promised me we were expanding the brand. You promised me a new Porsche for my birthday. Where is the money, Preston? Where is the money?" "There is no money," Richard yelled back, his voice cracking under the sheer weight of his ruined legacy. "He lost everything." Kiara sank to her knees on the top step, burying her face in her hands, screaming hysterically. Her entire identity was tied to this mansion. Her millions of followers only cared about her because she projected wealth. Without the Oakwood estate, she was nothing. Without the platinum corporate card, she was a fraud. Down in the foyer, Diane slowly began to regain consciousness, groaning weakly as she opened her eyes to the nightmare. The grand $2.8 million mansion, which had stood for decades as a monument to their superiority and their ego, was now filled with the sounds of weeping, screaming, and total despair. The impenetrable fortress of the Golden Child had fallen. The abyss had opened up and swallowed them whole, and they were absolutely powerless to stop the descent. The espresso machine hummed a quiet, expensive tune in the massive kitchen of my downtown Chicago penthouse. Outside, the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city was waking up to a brisk, gray morning. I stood at the marble island wearing a tailored silk blouse, holding a warm ceramic mug. The contrast between my pristine, silent sanctuary and the absolute war zone I knew was currently tearing apart the Oakwood estate was deeply satisfying. I had orchestrated their destruction with surgical precision, and now I was simply waiting for the inevitable shockwaves to reach my shoreline. My private cell phone vibrated violently against the marble countertop, shattering the morning quiet. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed my mother name, Diane. She had not reached out since the country club disaster, not even to apologize for her unhinged attempt to get me fired from my investment firm. Now facing the brutal reality of an eviction notice taped to her custom front door, she was miraculously remembering that she had a highly successful daughter. I did not answer. I let the phone vibrate until the call failed. 10 seconds later, it rang again. I ignored it a second time. The frantic ringing stopped immediately, followed by the sharp chime of an incoming text message. Then another, and another in rapid succession. I took a slow sip of my dark roast coffee, picked up the device, and opened the message thread. It was a masterpiece of maternal manipulation, a desperate rambling block of text completely devoid of any actual accountability. "Hannah, please. You have to answer me. We are in a terrible crisis. The bank sent a sheriff to the house this morning. They are threatening to foreclose. Your brother made a tiny mistake with a corporate loan, and now they are trying to take our home. The company is completely bankrupt. I am terrified, Hannah. My heart cannot take this stress. The bank says we need $150,000 to cover the immediate bridge loan penalty before this Friday, or they will change the locks. You have that kind of money. I know you do. You have to help us. We are your family. Please transfer the funds today." I read the message twice, marveling at the breathtaking audacity woven into every single sentence. A tiny mistake. That was how Diane categorized her golden boy secretly mortgaging their $2.8 million estate to predatory shadow bankers. She was still protecting him. She was still shielding Preston from the catastrophic weight of his own profound incompetence. Even as she stood in the ruins of her precious high society life, watching the walls cave in, she refused to hold her son accountable for destroying their legacy. And the requested amount was almost comical. $150,000. Diane was so financially illiterate, so deeply sheltered from the actual mechanics of corporate debt, that she truly believed a six-figure check would stop an accelerated commercial foreclosure. She had no idea that the penalty fee was just the tip of the iceberg. She had no idea that the total debt was $12 million. Most importantly, she had absolutely no idea that the ruthless, faceless bank she was so terrified of was actually a blind trust entirely controlled by the daughter she had publicly disowned. I thought back to the night at the country club. I remembered the harsh clink of the champagne glasses. I remembered my father standing tall, declaring that Preston deserved the empire because he was loyal, while I was discarded for choosing my own career. I remembered Diane sliding that $4,500 dinner bill across the table, sneering at me, demanding I pay for a celebration I was not even welcome at. They had actively tried to ruin my reputation, destroy my career, and strip me of my dignity. They had told me I was not part of their family. Now, staring down the barrel of a financial execution, they suddenly wanted to play the family card. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the lingering guilt of a dutiful daughter. I felt the cold, absolute clarity of an apex predator who had successfully cornered her prey. I set my coffee mug down on the marble counter. I opened the digital keyboard on my phone. I did not type a long, emotional paragraph explaining why I would not help them. I did not hurl insults or demand an apology for the way they had treated me. Explanations are for people who care about being understood, and arguments are for people who still seek validation. I cared about neither. I only cared about delivering the final fatal blow to their delusional entitlement. I typed exactly 3 words. Ask your heir. I hit send. The small green bubble appeared on the screen, delivering the ultimate devastating payload directly into Diane's desperate manicured hands. Those 3 words held the weight of 1,000 insults. They were a razor-sharp mirror forced directly into her face, reminding her that she and Richard had made their choice. They had crowned Preston the king of their empire. They had bet their entire legacy on his non-existent genius. Now, as the castle burned to the ground around them, they could look to their king for salvation. I watched the screen for a moment. The typing indicator bubbled up instantly as Diane scrambled to reply, likely descending into a hysterical rage. The bubbles flashed on and off, But I did not wait to read her frantic response. I tapped the contact settings and permanently blocked her number. I locked the screen of my phone and flipped the device face down on the counter. The silence in my penthouse remained perfectly undisturbed. I picked up my coffee, walking over to the expansive windows to look out over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The financial markets were opening. My firm was generating millions. My personal assets were completely secure. Down in the suburbs, the Oakwood estate was burning to the ground, and I had just explicitly informed them that I would not spare a single drop of water to put out the flames. The lobby of the Sovereign Tower in downtown Chicago was a fortress of polished marble brushed steel and hushed exclusivity. Billionaires, tech founders, and top-tier corporate executives paid millions of dollars for the absolute guarantee of privacy and security. The ambient sound was usually nothing more than the soft synchronized hum of the private elevators and the polite low-volume greetings of the white-gloved concierge staff. That perfect expensive tranquility was violently shattered just before noon. The heavy revolving glass doors at the main entrance were forcefully shoved open. My father Richard stormed into the pristine lobby, his face a terrifying blotchy shade of crimson. Close behind him was my mother Diane, her designer makeup smeared across her cheeks from crying, and my sister-in-law Kiara. Kiara was furiously tapping her phone screen, likely trying to go live on social media to broadcast her manufactured victimhood to her followers. They looked entirely out of place, a trio of desperate, unhinged suburbanites crashing into a sanctuary of true elite power. "I demand to see my daughter immediately." Richard bellowed, his voice bouncing aggressively off the imported marble walls. The sudden violent noise caused several high-profile residents to stop in their tracks, turning in shock to witness the spectacle. He marched directly toward the main concierge desk, slamming his fist hard against the polished stone counter. "Her name is Hannah. She lives in the penthouse. Call her down here right now. Do you know who I am? I am a highly respected businessman." The head of building security, a former military officer named Thomas, stepped forward smoothly, placing his imposing frame between my father and the private residential elevator banks. "Sir, you need to lower your voice and step back toward the exit," Thomas instructed, with firm, unyielding authority. "You cannot enter the residential elevators without prior authorization from the tenant, and you are currently disturbing the peace of this building." Kiara shoved her way to the front, pointing her phone camera directly at the security staff. "This is discrimination," she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly across the quiet lobby. "We are her family. She is stealing our money and letting us go homeless. She is a fraud. I am going to expose this entire building and everyone in it." Diane clutched her expensive handbag to her chest, sobbing loudly for maximum dramatic effect. "Tell that ungrateful, selfish brat to come down here and face her parents. She owes us her life. She is letting the bank take our home. She has the money to save us." Up in my penthouse, the secure video intercom on my wall chimed softly. I accepted the live feed and watched the chaotic, humiliating scene unfolding 40 floors below me. Thomas informed me of the severe disturbance, stating that Chicago police units were already stationed in the immediate vicinity and ready to respond to the strict trespassing protocol of the building. I authorized the police intervention without a single ounce of hesitation and grabbed my tailored suit jacket. I did not rush. I took the private express elevator down the smooth, silent descent, perfectly matching my calm, dropping heart rate. The polished steel doors slid open, revealing the absolute circus my biological family had become. A crowd of wealthy residents and building staff had gathered at a safe distance, watching the public meltdown with a mixture of deep disgust and fascination. I stepped out of the elevator, my high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The crisp sound cut through my father screaming. Richard turned, his eyes locking onto me, his expression twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. "There she is," Richard roared, pointing an accusing finger at me as he tried to physically push past the security line. "You arrogant, selfish little girl. You think you can send your mother a smart text message while our entire legacy burns to the ground. You think this is a game. You are going to write a check for $150,000 right now, or I swear to God I will drag you out of this building myself." Diane rushed forward, crying hysterically, pulling at her hair. "Hannah, how could you do this to us? We gave you everything. We are your parents. You are letting them throw us onto the street like garbage." Kiara held her phone up high, aiming the camera lens directly at my face. "Show everyone what a monster you are." Kiara yelled, her influencer persona completely cracking under the crushing weight of her impending bankruptcy. "Show everyone how you treat the people who built you. You are nothing but a jealous, bitter outcast who hates seeing us win." I stood exactly 10 feet away from them, completely untouched by their explosive emotional outbursts. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself against their pathetic, delusional accusations. I simply looked at Richard, Diane, and Kiara with the cold, detached observation of a professional liquidator inspecting a worthless, toxic asset. I did not see a father, a mother, and a sister-in-law. I saw a massive financial liability that needed to be permanently discarded from my property. "You are trespassing on private property," I stated, my voice echoing with absolute freezing calm that chilled the entire lobby. "You have exactly 10 seconds to leave this building before you are arrested and charged." Richard scoffed, his ego blinding him to the very real danger he was in. He took another aggressive step forward, fully intending to physically intimidate me. "I am your father," he snarled, his face twisting with venom. "You do not give me orders. I am not leaving this spot until I get my money." I slowly raised my hand and gave a single dismissive nod to Thomas. The heavy glass doors of the lobby swung open, and 4 uniformed Chicago police officers swiftly entered the building. The officers did not hesitate. They moved in perfect tactical formation, intercepting my father before he could take another step toward me. "Sir, place your hands behind your back," the lead officer commanded, gripping Richard's arm with uncompromising, brutal force. Richard's eyes widened in absolute shock as the cold steel handcuffs snapped securely around his wrists. "What are you doing?" he shouted, his arrogance instantly turning into sheer pathetic panic. "Get your hands off me. I am a wealthy man. I am her father. You cannot arrest me." Diane began to scream hysterically as a second officer secured her wrists, forcefully bending her arms behind her back. Kiara dropped her phone on the marble floor, the screen shattering into pieces as an officer pushed her firmly against the concierge desk to cuff her. She wailed loudly, sobbing uncontrollably about her rights, her luxury lifestyle, and her social media followers. Dozens of elite residents stood in stunned silence, watching the former king and queen of the Oakwood Country Club being violently subdued and treated like common street criminals. I stood perfectly still, my expression completely unreadable, watching the police drag my screaming, handcuffed family out of the pristine lobby. The heavy glass doors closed behind them, shutting off their noise completely. The lobby returned to its hushed, exclusive tranquility. The toxic chapter of my life was finally over, and I had not even broken a sweat. The cold reality of a Chicago police precinct holding cell is a brutal contrast to the velvet-lined booths of an exclusive country club. It took 12 grueling hours, and the absolute last remnants of their personal emergency cash to post bail. Richard, Diane, and Kiara walked out of the sterile concrete building into the freezing night air, completely stripped of their dignity and their untouchable suburban armor. Their designer clothes were deeply wrinkled and stained with the unmistakable grime of the city processing center. Diane clutched her ruined silk blouse against the chilling wind, shivering violently, no longer the pristine matriarch who judged others from her high horse. Kiara walked 10 paces ahead of them, aggressively tapping her cracked phone screen, her face twisted in a permanent, furious scowl. They rode back to the suburbs in an overpriced rideshare vehicle, sitting in a suffocating, highly toxic silence. The illusion of their invincible dynasty had been violently shattered in front of dozens of elite witnesses, and the crushing reality of their impending homelessness was finally setting in. The moment they stepped through the heavy oak doors of the Oakwood estate, the fragile, unspoken truce completely evaporated. The mansion, once a symbol of their superiority, now felt like a massive tomb waiting to be sealed. Preston was pacing the grand foyer like a trapped animal chewing on his fingernails, his eyes bloodshot from a severe lack of sleep. He had spent the entire day hiding in the house, dodging calls from furious vendors and aggressive bankruptcy lawyers who demanded upfront cash retainers he simply did not possess. As Kiara stormed past him toward the sweeping marble staircase, Preston reached out and grabbed her arm. His voice was frantic, laced with a pathetic, whining desperation that completely erased any remaining trace of his golden child confidence. He begged her to open her massive walk-in closet. He told her they needed fast liquidity to hire a ruthless defense attorney and stave off the final foreclosure decree. He pleaded with her to sell the rare luxury handbags, the imported Cartier watches, and the heavy diamond necklaces she had aggressively purchased using the bleeding corporate accounts over the past 6 months. He framed it as a temporary sacrifice to save their marriage and their home. Kiara ripped her arm out of his grasp with such violent force that Preston actually stumbled backward against the decorative wainscoting. Her eyes blazed with absolute unfiltered contempt. She looked at the man she thought was a billionaire titan and saw nothing but a weak, incompetent fraud standing in the ruins of his own stupidity. She unleashed a torrential wave of verbal abuse that echoed sharply off the high ceilings. She screamed that her luxury collection was her personal brand, her only remaining asset, and the sole reason her 2 million online followers still cared about her existence. She completely and utterly refused to sacrifice a single piece of her jewelry to plug the catastrophic financial holes he had so carelessly dug. She called him a pathetic failure, a man who had to ride his father's coattails straight into a brick wall because he lacked the basic intelligence to run a lemonade stand, let alone a manufacturing empire. She viciously reminded him that he was the idiot who blindly signed away the deed to the house, not her. The chosen heir stood there utterly paralyzed, absorbing the brutal, undeniable truth from the wife who only ever loved his bank account. While his son was being verbally shredded in the hallway, Richard locked himself inside his dark, wood-paneled home office. He collapsed into his heavy leather executive chair, a broken, exhausted old man facing the absolute end of his bloodline legacy. The aggressive roar of his country club persona was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow, sinking dread. He opened his laptop, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the bright, unforgiving screen. The legal notice of default sat on his desk, bearing the terrifying name of the shadow entity that now legally owned his entire life. Obsidian Financial Management. He did not know who was running the fund. He envisioned a boardroom full of ruthless Wall Street sharks, cold men in expensive suits who held the supreme power to either destroy him completely or grant him a miraculous second chance. Richard opened a blank email draft. The proud patriarch who had spent his entire life demanding respect, belittling his daughter and refusing to apologize for his arrogance, was now forced to crawl on his hands and knees. He typed out a desperate, rambling message addressed to the managing directors of the trust. He practically begged through the digital text. He pleaded for a 90-day extension on the bridge loan penalty. He promised aggressive corporate restructuring, massive employee layoffs, and a total overhaul of the manufacturing supply chain. He begged them to consider the human cost, explicitly mentioning his advanced age, his wife's fragile health, and the legacy he had spent 40 years building. He asked for mercy from the corporate executioners, offering to surrender his equity, his board seats, and his final shreds of pride, as long as they did not seize his residential estate and throw his family onto the street. With a heavy, defeated sigh, Richard clicked send, launching his pathetic plea into the digital void, praying for a financial miracle. Across the city, high above the chaotic streets, in a glowing penthouse office, my encrypted laptop chimed with a priority incoming message. The dedicated secure server for Obsidian Financial Management received exactly one email. I sat in my ergonomic chair, swirling a glass of expensive red wine, and opened the message. I read every single word of my father's desperate, groveling plea. I read the paragraphs where he begged for mercy, the specific sentences where he offered to surrender his entire kingdom just to save his own skin and his suburban fortress. The man who had looked me in the eye at a lavish dinner and told me I was not part of his family was now digitally on his knees crying out to a faceless corporate entity to spare his life. He had absolutely no idea he was sending his prayers directly to the daughter he had thrown away. He did not know that the merciless Wall Street shark he was trying to negotiate with was sitting in a silk blouse drinking wine and watching his empire burn from the comfort of a high-rise. I did not reply to his pathetic begging. I simply forwarded the email to Bennett with a strict, singular instruction: prepare the final liquidation orders for the bankruptcy court. The time for begging had expired the moment they tried to destroy my career. The Dirksen Federal Building in downtown Chicago is a towering monolith of steel and dark glass. It is a place completely devoid of warmth, sympathy, or country club etiquette. The air inside smells faintly of floor wax, stale coffee, and the distinct, suffocating scent of financial ruin. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B stood closed, guarding the chambers where multi-million-dollar empires were routinely dismantled and sold for scrap. This was the venue for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation hearings. It is not a place where businesses go to be saved. It is the slaughterhouse where they go to be carved up and permanently erased from the public registry. Sitting on the hard, unforgiving wooden benches in the sterile corridor outside the courtroom was the absolute shattered remains of my biological family. They had dressed for a war they had already lost. Richard wore his most expensive custom-tailored navy suit paired with a power red silk tie. It was the exact outfit he wore when he wanted to intimidate regional suppliers or impress the elite investors at his private social clubs. But today, the suit hung slightly loose on his frame. The stress of the past few weeks had carved deep, dark lines into his face. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, clutching a thick leather binder to his chest like a physical shield. Inside that binder were his desperate, entirely useless proposals for a corporate restructuring plan. He still foolishly believed he could walk into a Chapter 7 liquidation hearing, flash a confident smile, shake hands with the unseen executives of Obsidian Financial Management, and somehow charm his way into a Chapter 11 reorganization. He was fully convinced that his legacy meant something to the creditors holding his debt. Beside him, Diane was trying desperately to hold on to the final fraying threads of her high society matriarch persona. She wore a modest, yet fiercely expensive black designer dress, adorned with her signature string of authentic pearls. She had spent 2 hours that morning applying her makeup, attempting to hide the swollen, red-rimmed eyes and the exhausted pallor of a woman who was days away from being thrown out of her own mansion. Her manicured hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles completely white from the strain. Every time the heavy doors of an adjacent courtroom opened, she flinched, visibly terrified that the media or her wealthy suburban friends might be lurking in the corridors to witness her ultimate public humiliation. Preston sat on the other side of his father, looking like a terrified little boy, wearing his dad-oversized clothes. He was sweating profusely through his premium cotton shirt. He kept shifting his weight on the uncomfortable wooden bench, his eyes darting frantically down the long, empty hallway. Preston had finally realized that his golden child status offered absolutely zero protection against federal bankruptcy laws. There was no mother to coddle him here. There was no father who could write a check to make the scary auditors go away. He was the sole managing trustee who had legally signed the cross-collateralized loans. He was the one who had committed blatant documented corporate fraud by cooking the accounting books. The sheer terror of potential federal prison time was practically radiating off his trembling shoulders. And then there was Kiara. My sister-in-law sat at the extreme far edge of the bench, deliberately creating as much physical distance between herself and the sinking ship of the family as humanly possible. She wore dark, oversized designer sunglasses indoors, hiding her face from the public. While Richard rehearsed his pathetic negotiation speeches and Diane prayed for a financial miracle, Kiara was operating with ruthless, cold-blooded efficiency. Her expensive mobile phone was pressed tightly between her hands. The screen brightness turned down low to shield her actions from Preston. She was not texting friends for emotional support. She was not searching for last-minute bankruptcy loopholes to save the Oakwood estate. Kiara was executing a scorched earth exit strategy. Her thumbs flew rapidly across the digital keyboard as she messaged two of the most aggressive high-priced divorce attorneys in the state of Illinois. She was frantically sending them screenshots of her personal bank accounts, attempting to legally separate her influencer income from Preston catastrophic corporate liabilities before the judge slammed the gavel. She swiped over to her social media profiles. With rapid, merciless precision, she was actively deleting every single photograph and video that featured Preston's face. She erased the anniversary posts. She deleted the videos of them touring the country club. She wiped out the grand, delusional clips where she bragged about being married to a billionaire CEO. She was digitally scrubbing him from her life in real time, surgically removing the cancer of his failure from her carefully curated personal brand. Every time Preston looked over at her seeking even a fraction of spousal support, Kiara angled her body further away, staring at her screen with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. Richard leaned over, tapping Preston harshly on the knee. He spoke in a hoarse, urgent whisper, trying to inject some artificial courage into his terrified air. "Listen to me," Richard hissed, gripping the leather binder. "When the representatives from Obsidian Financial walk through those doors, you stand up straight. You look them directly in the eye. We do not beg, we negotiate. These Wall Street guys only care about the bottom line. I will present the workforce reduction plan. I will show them how we can liquidate the secondary warehouses to resume the bridge loan payments. We just need to convince them to drop the residential foreclosure and give us 90 days to restructure the manufacturing debt. You let me do the talking. We are going to walk out of here with our house." Preston nodded rapidly, swallowing hard, desperately wanting to believe the absolute fiction his father was selling. He wiped his sweaty palms on his tailored trousers. "Okay, Dad. Okay. You handle the negotiation. I will back up the numbers. We can fix this." Diane reached out and placed a trembling hand on Richard's shoulder. "Who do you think they sent?" she whispered, her voice laced with dread. "The fund managers. Do you think it is a full legal team? We do not even know who runs this company. They have ignored every single email and phone call you made. They sent a shark." Richard replied grimly, staring at the heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B. "That is how these predatory funds operate. They send a cold-blooded executive with zero emotional attachment to the asset, some ruthless corporate suit who is going to try to intimidate us into surrendering the equity. But they have never negotiated with me before. I built a legacy. I know how to handle aggressive capitalists. We hold our ground." The massive wall clock at the end of the sterile corridor ticked forward with a loud mechanical clack. It was exactly 9 in the morning, the scheduled time for the preliminary liquidation hearing. The heavy brass handle of the courtroom door began to turn. Richard immediately stood up, buttoning his suit jacket and pulling his shoulders back, puffing out his chest to project the illusion of power. Diane stood beside him, lifting her chin, putting on her absolute best high society armor. Preston scrambled to his feet, clutching his briefcase like a life preserver. Even Kiara paused her frantic texting, lowering her sunglasses slightly to see the face of the financial Grim Reaper who had purchased their entire existence. They braced themselves to face a room full of terrifying, faceless Wall Street executives. They were preparing to fight a ruthless, unknown enemy for the survival of their dynasty. They had absolutely no idea that the monster stepping out of the shadows to execute their financial death sentence was the very same woman they had banished from their dinner table. The heavy mahogany doors of courtroom 4B swung open with a resounding, violent thud that echoed sharply down the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridor of the federal building. A professionally dressed court bailiff stepped out, holding a clipboard, officially calling the docket for the liquidation hearing. Richard instantly straightened his posture, forcefully plastering on his most charming, persuasive country club smile. He eagerly extended his right hand, fully prepared to vigorously shake the hand of the ruthless Wall Street executive he had been desperately emailing for weeks. He adjusted his red silk tie, ready to deploy his decades of polished business acumen to save his crumbling empire. He never spoke a single word. His voice died completely in his throat. Stepping out from the shadows of the adjacent private consultation room was not a faceless private equity manager. The first person to step into the corridor was Bennett. My senior legal partner wore a flawless, custom-tailored charcoal suit, carrying a heavy leather briefcase that contained the absolute financial execution of the family standing before him. Two junior associate attorneys flanked him, moving in perfect, intimidating synchronization. They formed a protective, aggressive wedge, parting the corridor like a corporate strike team. And then stepping out from behind that formidable wall of corporate attorneys was me. I wore a striking razor-sharp white power suit that stood out violently against the drab gray walls of the federal courthouse. My high heels struck the linoleum floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I did not look angry. I did not look vindictive. I looked utterly bored. I carried the effortless, icy authority of an apex predator who had already won the war long before ever stepping onto the battlefield. The psychological impact of my appearance hit my biological family with the destructive force of a kinetic strike. Richard's extended hand froze in mid-air, trembling slightly before dropping limply to his side. The aggressive, confident color drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a sickly ashen pale. He looked as though the floor had simply vanished beneath his expensive leather shoes. Diane let out a sharp, audible gasp, taking a physical step backward until her spine hit the cold concrete wall of the corridor. Her hands flew to her mouth to cover a silent scream. Her eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. She looked at my pristine white suit, then at the aggressive legal team flanking me, and her brain completely short-circuited. The daughter she had publicly labeled a failure, the woman she had tried to get fired with a fraudulent phone call, was currently commanding a fleet of high-priced lawyers. Preston looked like a man who was actively having a heart attack. His jaw literally dropped open. He looked frantically at his father, then back at me, his mind desperately trying to process how the sister he had mocked and discarded was currently walking toward him with the posture of a reigning monarch. He began to sweat profusely, wiping his forehead with a shaking hand. Kiara actually ripped her oversized designer sunglasses off her face. She stared at me with a raw, unfiltered shock that entirely broke her carefully curated influencer facade. The arrogant smirk she usually wore was completely obliterated. For the first time in her entire life, my sister-in-law was entirely speechless, her mouth hanging slightly open as she took in the undeniable display of my extreme wealth and power. I did not stop walking. I did not acknowledge their existence. I walked directly past them, moving closer than an arm length away, and I did not even spare them a single fleeting glance. To me, they were completely invisible. They were nothing more than the ink and paper sitting inside Bennett's briefcase. I walked straight into courtroom 4B, the heavy doors held open by my junior associates. The interior of the courtroom was intimidating, paneled in dark wood, with the judge-elevated bench looming at the front. I moved purposefully toward the plaintiff table, the side of the room explicitly reserved for the secured creditors. Bennett pulled out the heavy wooden chair for me. I sat down, smoothing my white jacket and placing my own sleek leather portfolio onto the polished table. A moment later, the family stumbled into the courtroom. They moved like sleepwalkers, entirely disoriented, their previous negotiation strategy completely incinerated by my mere presence. Richard practically dragged his feet to the debtor table on the opposite side of the aisle. Preston collapsed into his chair, staring at me as if I were holding a loaded weapon. Diane and Kiara sat behind them in the public gallery, gripping the wooden pews so hard their knuckles turned stark white. They were whispering frantically to each other, their voices laced with pure, unadulterated panic. Richard was leaning over to Preston, desperately trying to convince himself that I was just a hired consultant, that I had somehow been employed by Obsidian Financial to mediate the family dispute. He was clinging to the very last shred of his shattered delusion, refusing to believe that his discarded daughter was the one holding the axe. The side door opened, and the federal bankruptcy judge entered the room. Everyone stood. The judge took his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and looked down at the massive stack of liquidation filings before him. He slammed his wooden gavel once the sharp crack signaling the official commencement of their financial funeral. We are here today for the preliminary Chapter 7 liquidation hearing regarding the corporate manufacturing entity and all associated cross-collateralized assets. The judge announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. He flipped through the thick legal documents and then peered over his glasses at my side of the aisle. Let us establish the parties for the official record. Who is present today as the legally authorized representative for the primary secured creditor, Obsidian Financial Management? I stood up slowly, ensuring every single eye in that courtroom was locked directly onto me. The silence was absolute and suffocating. I buttoned the center button of my white suit jacket with agonizing, deliberate precision. I picked up a heavy silver fountain pen from the table and tapped it exactly once against the polished wood. The soft click rang out like a gunshot. I turned my head just a fraction of an inch, making direct, unflinching eye contact with my father for the very first time since the night he disowned me at the country club. I watched the remaining spark of hope in his eyes completely extinguish. "Good morning, Your Honor," I stated, my voice ringing out with a cold, crystal-clear authority that commanded the entire room. "I am Hannah. I am the Chief Executive Officer and sole Managing Director of Obsidian Financial Management. I am the legal entity holding the primary lien, and I am the absolute owner of 100% of their corporate assets, their manufacturing supply chain, and the deed to their residential home." The federal bankruptcy judge did not flinch at the stunning family revelation. In courtroom 4B, the only currency that mattered was legally binding debt, and I had just proven I held all of it. The judge simply adjusted his microphone and looked over at the debtor table. He asked Richard and his court-appointed attorney if they had a formal proposal for Chapter 11 reorganization to present to the secured creditor. Richard completely ignored his own lawyer. He stood up, his hands gripping the edge of the heavy wooden table. The proud, arrogant patriarch who had spent his entire life commanding rooms and demanding absolute respect was entirely gone. In his place stood a broken, terrified old man who was finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his own terrible judgment. "Hannah, please," Richard stammered, his voice cracking loudly in the silent courtroom. He was blatantly violating judicial protocol, speaking directly to me across the aisle instead of addressing the judge. "We are family. I know I was harsh at the country club. I know we said things we should not have said, but I built this company from nothing. I spent 40 years creating this legacy. You cannot just tear it down. I sent you a restructuring plan. Just give us 90 days. Give us a chance to fix this. I am begging you." Diane let out a loud, pathetic sob from the public gallery behind him. Preston kept his head down, staring at the floor, too cowardly to even look at the sister he had mocked his entire life. I did not blink. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or familial obligation. I looked at the man who had publicly disowned me, and I saw absolutely nothing but a toxic asset that needed to be permanently liquidated. I picked up the thick leather binder containing his desperate, pathetic restructuring proposal. I held it up for a brief second before dropping it carelessly back onto the table. The heavy thud echoed through the room like a closing vault door. "Your Honor," I stated, directing my gaze entirely to the judge and completely ignoring my father's desperate plea. "The primary secured creditor, Obsidian Financial Management, categorically rejects any and all proposals for Chapter 11 reorganization. We will not entertain a single request for a 90-day extension." Richard's face turned an ashen, sickly gray. "But we can turn a profit," he interrupted, his voice rising in sheer panic. "We just need time to fix the supply chain. You have to listen to me. I am your father." I turned my head slowly and looked directly into his eyes. The temperature in the courtroom seemed to instantly drop to freezing. "You made it abundantly clear that you are not my father," I said, my voice slicing through the air with surgical, merciless precision. You stood in front of the entire Chicago elite and explicitly stated that I was not a part of your family. You told me that I got nothing because I refused to be an unpaid assistant. You looked me dead in the eye and said that a true leader knows when it is time to pass the torch to the next generation. I paused, letting his own arrogant words echo back at him in the worst possible venue. Well, you passed the torch to your chosen heir, I continued, gesturing vaguely toward Preston, who flinched physically. And your golden boy immediately used that torch to burn your entire empire to the absolute ground. Richard opened his mouth to argue, but he had absolutely no defense. He was completely paralyzed by the reflection of his own colossal stupidity. You told me Preston deserved the company because he was loyal, I stated, amplifying the volume of my voice so the court reporter would catch every single syllable. You told me that business is about results and that my results showed failure. Let us examine your chosen successor results. Your brilliant CEO completely bypassed standard procurement protocols and signed catastrophic contracts with unvetted vendors. When he ran out of cash, he actively committed corporate fraud. He intentionally forged internal accounting reports and handed them to you at the dinner table while you patted him on the back. Diane gasped loudly from the gallery. Richard looked down at Preston, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization that the public humiliation was only just beginning. And when his forged numbers could not pay the bills, your genius son went to a shadow bank, I said, delivering the ultimate fatal blow. He secretly signed a cross-collateralized bridge loan with a 22% interest rate. He legally mortgaged your $2.8 million estate to cover up his own spectacular incompetence. You told me I was a failure, Richard. But right now, your results show absolute, unmitigated failure on all fronts. I turned my back on my father, completely dismissing his existence, and focused entirely on the federal judge. Your Honor, the management of this corporation is grossly incompetent and deeply compromised by documented financial fraud, I stated, speaking with the flawless, relentless authority of a senior liquidator. The debtor has zero cash reserves, zero viable supply lines, and zero capacity to cure the massive default. Therefore, Obsidian Financial Management officially petitions this court for an immediate Chapter 7 liquidation. We demand the complete dissolution of the corporate entity. All manufacturing equipment, intellectual property, and commercial real estate must be seized and sold at auction by the end of the month. I picked up my silver pen, resting my hand on the final page of my legal filing. Furthermore, I concluded, my voice ringing with total, uncompromising finality. As the legal holder of the cross-collateralized residential deed, we are executing our right to accelerate the foreclosure. We are officially requesting a federal eviction mandate for the Oakwood estate. I want the locks changed, and I want all occupants removed from the property within exactly 48 hours. The courtroom fell into a deathly, suffocating silence. The judge reviewed the unassailable legal documents provided by Bennett. He looked at the mountain of fraudulent debt, the undeniable signatures, and the absolute legal right of my blind trust. There was no leniency to be given. The math was completely undeniable. The judge picked up his wooden gavel. Petition for Chapter 7. Liquidation is granted, the judge announced, his voice booming with federal authority. The corporate entity is hereby dissolved. All assets are to be surrendered to the primary secured creditor. The residential foreclosure is accelerated and approved. The debtors have 48 hours to vacate the premises. The sharp, heavy crack of the gavel hitting the sounding block sounded like a gunshot. It was over. The execution was complete. Richard's knees finally buckled. He collapsed heavily back into his hard wooden chair, gasping for air as if the oxygen had been entirely vacuumed out of the room. He clutched his chest, staring blankly at the polished table. The legacy he had spent 40 years building, the empire he had weaponized against me, was officially vaporized. Preston buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a pathetic, high-pitched sob. He was no longer a CEO. He was no longer a wealthy heir. He was an unemployed, disgraced fraudster, facing potential criminal investigations with absolutely $0 to his name. Every single asset, every penny of the generational wealth he had been promised at the country club, had just officially evaporated into thin air. He had inherited the absolute world, and I had legally repossessed every single inch of it. The echo of the federal judge gavel hung in the stagnant air of courtroom 4B. It was the sound of an entire dynasty being instantly wiped from existence. The heavy wooden block had just crushed 40 years of my father's arrogant legacy into absolute dust. Richard remained slumped in his chair, his breathing shallow and rapid, his expensive custom suit now looking like a cheap costume on a broken man. Diane was frozen in the gallery behind him, her perfectly manicured hands covering her mouth, completely incapable of processing the sheer magnitude of their financial execution. Preston was actively weeping, his face buried in his hands, his shoulders shaking with loud, pathetic gasps. He had lost the company. He had lost the mansion. He had lost the illusion of his own superiority. But the true masterpiece of this disaster had not even happened yet. Sitting at the far end of the wooden pew, Kiara remained perfectly still for a fraction of a second. The oversized designer sunglasses she had used to hide her face were now pushed up onto her perfectly styled hair. Her dark eyes darted frantically around the federal courtroom, absorbing the cold, undeniable reality of the judge's final ruling. Kiara was not mourning the loss of a family business. She was not grieving for her husband's shattered ego. She was a lifestyle influencer, a woman who operated entirely on calculated optics and financial leverage. Her entire identity, her 2 million social media followers, her luxury brand deals, everything she had built was entirely dependent on being the wealthy wife of a corporate titan. The judge had just mathematically proven that her husband was not a titan. He was a colossal fraud with zero liquidity, facing potential federal prison time for cooking the accounting books. Kiara realized with terrifying clarity that staying married to Preston meant sinking to the bottom of the ocean with an anchor tied around her neck. She would be liable for his debts. She would be publicly humiliated. She would have to move out of a $2.8 million estate and into a cheap rented apartment. That was a reality she fundamentally refused to accept. The deafening silence of the courtroom was suddenly pierced by the sharp, harsh scrape of heavy wood against the linoleum floor. Kiara stood up. The movement was so abrupt, so filled with violent kinetic energy, that even the federal judge looked up from his paperwork. Richard turned his head slowly, his eyes hollow and defeated, expecting his daughter-in-law to offer some form of comfort, or perhaps collapse into tears alongside his wife. Diane reached out a trembling hand toward her. Kiara ignored Diane completely. She stepped out of the wooden pew and walked directly up to the debtor table where Preston was still openly sobbing. She did not offer a comforting hand. She did not speak softly. She stood over him, her posture rigid, with absolute unadulterated disgust. She looked down at the golden child, the man who had promised her the world, and delivered nothing but a monumental bankruptcy. "Stop crying like a pathetic child," Kiara commanded, her voice ringing out with such venomous, piercing clarity that it echoed off the dark wood panels of the courtroom. Preston flinched violently. He slowly lifted his tear-stained face from his hands, looking up at his wife with wide, desperate eyes. He reached out, seeking an anchor, seeking the partner who was supposed to stand by him through better or worse. Kiara swatted his hand away as if he were carrying a contagious disease. "Do not touch me," she snarled, her upper lip curling in pure revulsion. "You told me you were a genius. You told me you were taking over an empire. You let me plan renovations for a house you had already secretly mortgaged to a shadow bank. You are not a chief executive officer. You are a complete staggering failure who cannot even manage a basic supply chain without committing federal fraud." "Kiara, please," Preston begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whimper. "I can explain. We can figure this out together. I just need time." "There is no together." Kiara snapped, her voice rising in volume, entirely uncaring that a federal judge, a team of corporate lawyers, and I were watching her every move. "There is no time. You have exactly $0 to your name. You are a jobless, incompetent fraud who has to hide behind his mommy and daddy every time he makes a mistake. But they cannot write a check to save you this time, can they? They are just as broke as you are. I built my own brand. I built my own following. I refuse to let your pathetic, miserable incompetence drag my reputation into the gutter. Richard found a tiny, fleeting spark of his former arrogance. He tried to stand up to defend his precious son. Kiara. That is enough, Richard barked, though his voice lacked any real authority. You are his wife. You took a vow to support him. Kiara whipped her head around and glared at my father with such intense, blazing hostility that Richard actually sank back into his chair. I took a vow to a wealthy executive. Kiara fired back ruthlessly. Not a bankrupt criminal who lives in a fantasy world. You enabled him. You handed an entire corporation to an idiot just because you wanted a son to carry your name. Well, look at your name now. It is completely worthless. She turned her attention back to Preston. She raised her left hand, the hand displaying the massive 5-carat emerald-cut diamond ring she had purchased using the bleeding corporate credit card just weeks ago. With a swift, aggressive motion, she yanked the heavy diamond off her finger. She did not place it gently on the table. She threw it directly at Preston's face. The heavy ring struck Preston squarely in the chest and clattered loudly onto the wooden table, rolling to a stop right next to the liquidation documents. Keep the fake ring for your bankruptcy lawyers, Kiara demanded, her voice echoing with absolute finality. I sent all my financial documents to my attorneys 10 minutes ago. I am filing for an expedited divorce immediately. I want absolutely nothing to do with you, your delusional parents, or the massive pile of debt you created. Do not ever contact me again. Without waiting for a single response, Kiara turned on the heel of her designer shoes and marched straight down the center aisle of the courtroom. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Diane, who was now openly weeping into her hands. And she did not look at me. She shoved the heavy mahogany doors open and walked out into the corridor, abandoning the sinking ship of the family with breathtaking, spectacular speed. The heavy doors swung shut behind her, sealing the courtroom once again. The silence that fell over the room was heavier, darker, and more absolute than before. The golden child had been completely stripped of his armor. His company was gone. His mansion was gone. His parents were destitute. And now the wife he had tried so desperately to impress had publicly discarded him like a piece of worthless trash. I sat perfectly still at the plaintiff table, my hands resting lightly on my leather portfolio. I watched Preston staring blankly at the diamond ring resting on the table. I watched my father burying his face in his hands, completely broken. I watched my mother shivering in the gallery, her entire social standing erased. They had spent my entire life telling me I was a failure because I did not fit their perfect wealthy mold. They had built an entire dynasty on the foundation of an arrogant, useless son. Now that foundation had violently collapsed, and they were buried underneath the rubble. I did not feel a single shred of sympathy. I had orchestrated the financial execution, but they had provided every single weapon used against them. I smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. The destruction was absolutely magnificent. Exactly 48 hours after the federal judge slammed his wooden gavel, the brutal reality of a Chapter 7 liquidation descended upon the Oakwood estate. The crisp, biting morning wind swept through the affluent suburban streets, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of absolute financial ruin. Two marked county sheriff cruisers sat idling in the circular driveway, their heavy tires resting on the imported cobblestones. The flashing lights reflected off the towering white pillars of the $2.8 million mansion, serving as a harsh public beacon to the entire neighborhood that the reigning dynasty had officially fallen. I stood at the edge of the property line, wearing a sharply tailored camel trench coat against the morning chill, my hands resting calmly in my pockets. I was flanked by two private security contractors I had hired for the occasion, ensuring my physical perimeter remained perfectly unbreached. I did not come here to gloat or scream. I came here to officially take possession of my corporate assets and to oversee the physical eviction of the debtors. The grand custom oak front doors were propped wide open. Richard, Diane, and Preston were being systematically marched out of the estate under the strict, uncompromising supervision of the armed deputies. There were no luxury moving companies. There were no white-gloved handlers carefully wrapping antique vases. The bankruptcy court had seized all items of significant value to satisfy the massive commercial deficit. The family was only legally permitted to remove their basic everyday clothing and a few non-valuable personal effects. They were forced to carry their remaining possessions in cheap, flimsy brown cardboard boxes. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. Diane, a woman who had spent the last 3 decades defining her entire existence by her superior social status, was currently struggling to carry a taped-up cardboard box down her own front steps. Her signature pearl necklace was gone, seized as a highly liquid asset. Her face was entirely devoid of makeup, deeply lined with exhaustion, and the terrifying realization that she was about to become homeless. She stumbled slightly on the bottom step, the cardboard buckling under her grip, but the deputies simply urged her forward toward a battered, rented moving van parked on the street. Preston followed closely behind her. The arrogant golden child CEO who had blindly mortgaged his family future was completely unrecognizable. He shuffled his feet, his shoulders slumped in total devastating defeat. He looked absolutely hollowed out, carrying a single duffel bag containing the few cheap suits he was allowed to keep. His wife had publicly abandoned him, his company was vaporized, and he was currently under investigation for federal accounting fraud. He kept his eyes glued firmly to the pavement, entirely too cowardly to look at the neighbors who were watching the spectacle from their pristine lawns. Richard was the last to exit the mansion. The towering patriarch walked out of his castle with a small cardboard box clutched to his chest. His posture was completely shattered. He stopped at the end of the driveway and looked back at the towering facade of the estate he had spent 40 years building. He had sacrificed his own daughter to protect his ego and prop up his incompetent son. Now he was being escorted off the premises by armed law enforcement, completely stripped of his wealth, his legacy, and his dignity. As they loaded their pathetic boxes into the back of the rented van, a heavy, deafening roar echoed down the suburban street. A massive yellow diesel excavator rolled slowly around the corner, its thick steel treads grinding aggressively against the pristine asphalt. The massive construction vehicle parked directly in front of the estate, idling with a low, powerful rumble. A construction foreman in a hard hat hopped down from the cab and walked straight over to me holding a metal clipboard. "Morning, ma'am," the foreman said respectfully. "We are ready to break ground on the demolition phase whenever you give the word." I pulled my silver fountain pen from my coat pocket and signed the heavy stack of work orders. The Oakwood estate was not going to be my personal residence. I refused to live inside a monument built on their toxic delusions. Instead, I had already commissioned an elite architectural firm to execute a total property redevelopment. We were tearing down the entire east wing and the sprawling, perfectly manicured grounds to construct a corporate incubator and grant center. I was actively paving over their exclusionary, arrogant legacy to fund young, self-made entrepreneurs who actually had the intelligence and drive to succeed. "Start with the rose garden," I instructed the foreman, my voice carrying clearly through the crisp air. "Clear it entirely." The foreman nodded and signaled his operator. The excavator roared to life, pivoting its massive steel bucket toward the prized award-winning garden that Diane had meticulously curated for decades. The machine surged forward. The heavy steel teeth slammed violently into the manicured earth, ripping up the rare roses, shattering the imported marble fountains, and obliterating the custom landscaping in a matter of seconds. Diane whipped her head around at the sound of the destruction. She dropped the box she was holding, her hands flying to her mouth as a ragged, hysterical scream tore from her throat. She watched the ultimate symbol of her high society status being violently churned into dirt and debris. She collapsed against the side of the rented moving van, weeping uncontrollably, forced to watch the total erasure of her empire. I did not blink. I did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. Suddenly, my secondary business phone vibrated sharply inside my coat pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was Richard calling. I tapped the screen and engaged the speakerphone, letting the audio mix with the violent mechanical sounds of the excavator destroying his estate. "Hannah, please," Richard sobbed through the speaker. His voice was a guttural, weeping, thoroughly pathetic sound. It was the sound of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "We have nowhere to go. The cheap apartment requires a security deposit we do not have. Preston is having a complete nervous breakdown in the back of the van. We are your family. You proved your point. You won. Please just give us a fraction of the equity. We are begging you on our hands and knees. Do not leave us on the street." I stood perfectly still, listening to the absolute unmitigated destruction of his pride. For 33 years, this man had demanded my obedience, belittled my ambitions, and told me I was a failure because I refused to serve his golden child. He had cast me into the wilderness fully expecting me to fail. I did not argue with him. I did not offer a grand dramatic speech about vengeance or justice. Explanations are a privilege reserved for people you actually respect. They had made their choices, and these were the permanent, unalterable consequences. I ended the call with a single precise tap of my finger. I opened the side slot of the mobile device and extracted the tiny plastic subscriber identity module card. Holding it between my fingers, I snapped the chip cleanly in half. I walked over to the municipal trash bin sitting on the edge of the sidewalk and dropped both the broken chip and the phone directly into the garbage. The connection was permanently severed. They were entirely erased from my existence. I turned my back on the rented moving van, the weeping family, and the roaring construction equipment. I walked toward my sleek black Porsche parked at the curb. I opened the driver door, sliding into the premium leather seat, and gripped the steering wheel. I felt the absolute flawless weight of my own autonomy. They had chosen the wrong heir. They had gambled their entire bloodline on an incompetent fool and foolishly discarded the apex predator. I ignited the engine. The powerful, aggressive roar of the exhaust completely drowned out the last pathetic echoes of their crying. I shifted into gear and pressed the accelerator, launching the car down the suburban street without a single fleeting glance in the rearview mirror. I did not need to inherit their fragile throne. I had ripped their castle to the ground and built my own empire directly on top of their ruins. The revenge was absolute, perfect, and brutally complete. The ultimate lesson: your worth is not defined by their blindness. The story of this family's spectacular downfall is a masterclass in the dangerous illusion of entitlement and the undeniable power of absolute self-reliance. First and foremost, it exposes the fatal flaw of the golden child dynamic. Richard and Diane built their legacy on a fragile foundation of bias, blindly trusting an incompetent heir simply because he fit their traditional superficial mold. They confused arrogance with business acumen. This teaches us that unearned privilege will inevitably collapse under the weight of reality. A prestigious title does not magically grant you the skills to lead, and mortgaging your actual future to fund a fake social media-driven lifestyle is a guaranteed recipe for total ruin. On the flip side, the narrative proves that your worth is never determined by the people who fail to recognize it. When her family publicly discarded her, the protagonist didn't waste her energy crying or begging for a seat at their toxic table. Instead, she used their rejection as high-octane fuel to build her own unshakable empire. True power isn't about throwing emotional tantrums or seeking validation. It is about cold, calculated competence. She acquired absolute leverage through hard work, financial literacy, and impenetrable emotional boundaries. Ultimately, the most profound takeaway is about the true definition of family. Blood does not grant anyone a free pass for abuse, financial exploitation, or blatant disrespect. Sometimes the healthiest and most empowering thing you can do is to stop trying to fix a broken system. You owe absolutely nothing to those who only value you when it serves their narrative. The ultimate revenge is not just about tearing down their house of cards, it is about becoming so incredibly successful, autonomous, and untouchable that their opinions simply cease to matter. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own success from the ground up? Share your empowering story in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more epic tales of resilience and ultimate payback.